It began with an idea that sounded grand in theory and disastrous in reality. An army built not from a single nation, but from belief. The 5th SS Panzer Division, known as Wiking, was not formed because Germany lacked soldiers. It was formed because the regime believed ideology could replace identity, that loyalty to an idea could be stronger than loyalty to a homeland. Men were recruited from across Europe, from Scandinavia, the Low Countries, and beyond, drawn in by propaganda that framed the war as a crusade rather than an invasion. They were promised purpose, honor, and belonging. What they were given instead was one of the most brutal fronts in human history. From the beginning, Wiking was different and dangerous. It was shaped by myth, trained in obedience, and bound to a system that placed ideology above humanity. Though often described as a foreign volunteer division, that phrase hides a harsher truth. Many recruits were young, impressionable, and heavily indoctrinated. They entered a structure where questioning orders was not just discouraged, it was treated as betrayal. From its earliest days, the division was part of an organization that fused military operations with political terror. Wiking was sent east. There, the war was not fought as a conventional conflict between armies. It was fought as a campaign of annihilation. Villages became targets. Civilians were caught between advancing fronts. Prisoners were often not treated as prisoners at all. The division operated alongside and within a system where brutality was normalized and accountability erased. As Wiking advanced deeper into the Soviet Union, it gained experience quickly, and notoriety just as fast. On the battlefield, it showed coordination and aggression. Tanks and mechanized infantry moved with purpose. Officers emphasized speed and initiative. Losses were absorbed and replaced. But behind the front lines, and often directly alongside them, atrocities followed. These actions were not accidents of chaos. They were consistent with the environment and ideology in which the division operated. The Eastern Front did not reward illusion. Endless distances stretched supply lines thin. Summer heat turned roads into dust. Winter froze engines solid. Men slept beside vehicles to keep fuel from turning to sludge. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear pressed in constantly. Soviet resistance hardened with every mile. Encirclements became common. Casualties mounted in numbers that defied comprehension. At places like the Southern Front and later in desperate defensive battles, Wiking learned what it meant to fight a war that could not be won. Skill delayed defeat. Aggression bought time. Nothing reversed the direction of events. As the war turned against Germany, Wiking was rebuilt, reorganized, and sent back into combat again and again. It fought in Ukraine, in Hungary, and during the final chaotic months as the front collapsed inward. Fuel disappeared. Equipment dwindled. Replacements arrived with less training and even fewer illusions. The division that once believed itself chosen slowly became a formation fighting for survival rather than victory. And still, the system it served did not change. Crimes continued. Civilians suffered. The line between combat and cruelty remained erased. By the final months of the war, Wiking was no longer an elite formation in any meaningful sense. It was exhausted, depleted, and surrounded by inevitability. Some units surrendered, others fought until they could not. Many members would later face imprisonment, trials, and a lifetime reckoning with what they had been part of. The history of the 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking cannot be separated into two neat halves. Battlefield performance on one side, ideology on the other. They are inseparable. Its military actions existed within a system built on racial hatred, repression, and mass violence. Understanding that is not optional. It is essential. This is not a story told to admire. It is a story told to understand how belief can be weaponized, how myth can override morality, how competence can coexist with atrocity. Wiking stands as a warning, not of foreign volunteers alone, but of how easily identity and purpose can be manipulated into instruments of destruction. Tonight, we return to that history carefully and honestly, to the recruitment that promised meaning, to the front that delivered brutality, to the division that marched under ideology and left devastation behind it. Before we continue, I want to ground this moment in the present as well. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what time has found you there? Is it late where you are, or is the day just beginning to slow? If these long, unflinching journeys into difficult history help you think more clearly, question more deeply, or simply sit quietly with truths that are not comfortable but necessary, consider subscribing so these stories remain here for you whenever you want understanding instead of noise. Take a breath. This history is heavy, and it deserves to be told with care. December 5th, 1940, Berlin. A conference room in the Reich main security office where cigarette smoke hung thick beneath chandeliers that had once lit diplomatic balls. Felix Steiner sat across from Heinrich Himmler, spreading photographs across the mahogany table, young men in civilian clothes, Danes, Norwegians, Dutchmen, Flemings. The Reichsfuhrer SS leaned forward, his pale eyes scanning faces that didn't look German at all. Steiner's proposal was unprecedented. Forge these foreigners into an elite SS division, not as auxiliaries or laborers, but as equal combatants in Hitler's crusade. Himmler's finger stopped on a photograph of a blonde Norwegian fisherman. "This," he said quietly, "is what we've been searching for." The meeting that December afternoon would create something the world had never seen. A multinational SS division composed primarily of foreign volunteers, men who would swear allegiance not to their own nations but to Adolf Hitler personally. Steiner, a former Reichswehr officer with unconventional ideas about modern warfare, had convinced Himmler that Germanic peoples from occupied territories could form the nucleus of an ideologically pure fighting force. The racial ideology was explicit and disturbing. These weren't just any foreigners, but Nordic peoples whom Nazi pseudoscience classified as Aryan brothers, superior to Slavs and other groups the regime targeted for extermination. The division would be called Wiking, evoking the medieval Norse warriors who had once terrorized Europe. It was propaganda and military pragmatism intertwined, an attempt to legitimize Nazi conquest as a pan-European movement rather than German imperialism. The recruitment began immediately, with SS offices opening across occupied Europe in early 1941. In Copenhagen, young Danes read posters promising adventure and a monthly salary of 120 Reichsmarks, more than many earned in civilian jobs. In Amsterdam, Dutch fascists who had celebrated the German invasion now saw an opportunity to fight alongside their liberators against Bolshevism. In Oslo, Norwegian collaborators framed SS service as defending Nordic civilization against Asiatic communism. The motivations varied wildly. Some volunteers were genuine ideological Nazis who believed in Aryan supremacy and Hitler's racial vision. Others were opportunists seeking steady pay in economies ravaged by occupation. Many were simply young men seeking adventure, unable to imagine what they were truly joining. By March 1941, over 800 non-Germans had volunteered, with thousands more processing through recruitment offices. The volunteers converged on Senheim, a training camp in occupied Alsace, in the spring of 1941. Eric Walter, a 22-year-old Danish volunteer from Aarhus, stepped off the train into chaos. 7 different national flags hung above the barracks: the SS runic insignia, German swastika, Danish Dannebrog, Norwegian cross, Dutch tricolor, Finnish blue cross, and Flemish lion. Men shouted greetings in languages he couldn't understand. A German Hauptsturmführer barked orders that required 3 translators to convey to the assembled recruits. Walther had expected military discipline. Instead, he found linguistic mayhem. That first night, sitting in a barracks with a Norwegian fisherman, a Dutch carpenter, and a Finnish farmhand, none of whom shared a common language beyond broken German, Walther wrote in his diary, "What have I gotten myself into?" Felix Steiner had designed the training regimen personally, and it was unlike anything the Wehrmacht employed. Where traditional German infantry training emphasized obedience and parade ground precision, Steiner demanded initiative and physical excellence. Volunteers endured 16-week courses, double the Wehrmacht's standard 8 weeks. They ran 20-kilometer marches with full equipment. They practiced small unit tactics where corporals made decisions traditionally reserved for officers. They trained with live ammunition, with casualties considered acceptable costs of realism. Steiner believed modern warfare required soldiers who could think independently, not parade ground automatons. He also implemented combined arms training at the lowest levels, teaching infantry to work directly with artillery and armor rather than operating in isolation. Many volunteers, expecting traditional military service, found themselves physically and mentally broken by the demands. The multinational composition created unique challenges that went beyond language barriers. Danes and Norwegians had centuries-old grievances stemming from Norwegian independence movements. Flemish and Dutch volunteers argued over which group represented true Germanic culture. German cadre, despite Nazi ideology claiming all Germanic peoples were racial equals, often treated foreign volunteers as second-class soldiers, creating resentment that would simmer throughout the war. Food created unexpected conflicts. Scandinavian volunteers couldn't stomach German military rations, while Dutch volunteers complained about the quality of bread. Religious differences emerged when Finnish volunteers, many of them Lutheran pietists, objected to training on Sundays. These seemingly trivial issues revealed a deeper problem. Ideology might claim these men were brothers, but culture and history told a different story. Yet something remarkable happened over those 16 weeks. Shared hardship created bonds that transcended nationality. Erik Walter found himself trusting the Norwegian fisherman, whose name was Lars Eriksson, more than he'd trusted his own brother back in Denmark. They learned each other's languages through necessity, creating a pidgin German mixed with Scandinavian phrases. Inside jokes emerged that required multilingual knowledge to understand. When a Dutch volunteer named Peter Vanderberg saved Walter from drowning during a river crossing exercise, national identity ceased to matter. These men weren't becoming generic soldiers. They were becoming something new, a military unit whose identity derived from shared experience rather than shared homeland. Whether this transformation was genuine comradeship or manufactured unity for an evil cause would be tested in the fires ahead. By May 1941, the division had reached its initial formation strength, 19,377 men authorized, though actual strength hovered around 16,000. The German component comprised roughly 50%, primarily officers and technical specialists. Dutch and Flemish volunteers made up 23%, organized into Regiment Westland. Scandinavians, 15%, formed Regiment Nordland. Finns comprised 5%, while the remainder included ethnic Germans from occupied territories. The division's structure mirrored standard SS formations: 3 infantry regiments, an artillery regiment, reconnaissance battalion, anti-tank battalion, engineer battalion, and support services. What set Wiking apart was its motorization. Every infantry battalion had trucks or half-tracks, making it far more mobile than standard Wehrmacht infantry divisions that still relied heavily on horse-drawn transport. The final ceremony before deployment revealed the ideological poison at Wiking's core. On June 15, 1941, exactly 1 week before Operation Barbarossa would begin, 800 foreign volunteers assembled on the parade ground at Hübsch training area. Heinrich Himmler arrived by staff car, flanked by SS officers whose uniforms bore the Death's Head insignia. The volunteers stood in formation, organized by nationality, as Himmler delivered a speech that laid bare what they were truly joining. He spoke of racial destiny, of Germanic people's duty to destroy Jewish Bolshevism, of living space in the East that would be cleansed for German colonization. This wasn't defensive war or anti-communist crusade. This was explicit genocidal conquest. The volunteers then swore their oath. "I swear to you, Adolf Hitler, as Führer and Reich Chancellor, loyalty and bravery. I pledge to you and to those you have named to command me, obedience unto death, so help me God." Not loyalty to their homelands, not defense of Europe, personal allegiance to Hitler himself. Erik Walter stood in formation that day, repeating words that bound him to a regime whose full evil he couldn't yet comprehend. Years later, if he survived, he would claim he hadn't understood what he was swearing, but the speech had been translated into 5 languages. The racial ideology had been explicit throughout training. The SS insignia they wore carried meaning anyone could discover. Whatever mixture of ideology, adventure-seeking, and naivety had brought these men to this moment, they were now voluntarily sworn to the service of the Third Reich. In 7 days, they would cross into the Soviet Union as part of the largest invasion in human history. Some would die in the first hours. Others would survive years of horror. A few would eventually face war crimes trials, where prosecutors would present photographs from this very ceremony. But on June 15, 1941, with bands playing and flags waving, They believed they were embarking on a glorious crusade. History would judge them far more harshly than they judged themselves. June 22, 1941, 3:15 in the morning. The Ukrainian border near Sokol. Eric Walter crouched in darkness so complete he couldn't see his hands. Around him, invisible but present, 200 men from Westland Regiment's 3rd Company waited in the pre-dawn silence. Behind them, German artillery crews made final adjustments to howitzers aimed at Soviet border positions. Walter checked his rifle for the dozenth time, fingers finding the bolt by muscle memory. Lars Eriksson, the Norwegian fisherman who had become his closest friend during training, lay beside him in the grass. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. Then, at precisely 3:15, the night exploded. 1,500 guns opened fire simultaneously along Army Group South's front. The sound was physical, a pressure wave that punched Walter's chest, even 300 meters behind the artillery line. The sky lit up orange and red as shells arced towards Soviet positions. Tracer rounds from machine guns drew glowing lines across the darkness. Somewhere ahead, in those first seconds of Operation Barbarossa, Soviet soldiers were dying in their bunkers, caught completely by surprise despite weeks of intelligence warnings their leadership had ignored. Walter and his company waited, watching. The barrage. At 0400, whistles blew. Officers shouted orders in German, immediately translated by company interpreters into Dutch and Flemish. The soldiers of Wiking Division rose from the grass and began walking east, into the Soviet Union, into a war that would kill 27 million Soviet citizens and destroy any illusions about glorious combat. The first days were chaos masquerading as success. Wiking, attached to 3rd Panzer Corps of 1st Panzer Army, advanced as part of Army Group South's drive toward Kiev. The division's task was to keep pace with the armor, protecting the panzer's flanks while exploiting breakthroughs. For the Dutch and Scandinavian volunteers, the reality of blitzkrieg warfare was both more and less than they'd imagined. Villages burned, Soviet soldiers surrendered by the thousands, hands raised, looking terrified and starving. Abandoned equipment littered roadsides, trucks, horse carts, artillery pieces the Red Army had no time to destroy. The speed was intoxicating. In training, they'd advanced a few kilometers per day. Now they were covering 20, 30, 40 kilometers daily, riding on trucks and half-tracks, dismounting only when resistance appeared. By June 29th, Wiking had reached Lviv, having penetrated 150 kilometers into Soviet territory in 7 days. Then Lviv taught them what war actually meant. The city of 400,000 had changed hands before Wiking arrived, captured by Wehrmacht units 2 days earlier. What the German soldiers found horrified even men hardened by Poland and France campaigns. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, had massacred thousands of Ukrainian political prisoners in the city's prisons before retreating. Bodies filled cellars, shot in the head or beaten to death. The stench was overwhelming. Local Ukrainians, freed from Soviet control, blamed Jews for collaborating with the NKVD and began organizing pogroms. German authorities, rather than stopping the violence, encouraged it. Wiking troops entering Lviv on June 29th witnessed crowds hunting Jewish residents through streets, while Wehrmacht soldiers photographed the spectacle. Some Wiking soldiers participated in the violence. Unit records are incomplete, but post-war testimony places Dutch SS men among those involved in beatings and roundups. This was the reality of Hitler's crusade, not clean combat against Bolshevism, but race war and genocide from day one. Eric Walter saw his first combat death on July 8th, near Zhytomyr. The company was advancing along a dirt road when Soviet artillery opened fire from concealed positions. The first shell landed in the middle of 3rd Platoon, 30 meters ahead of Walter's position. He watched Peter Vanderberg, the Dutch volunteer who'd saved him from drowning during training, simply cease to exist. One moment a man, the next moment a crater and pieces. Men scattered, diving into ditches. The artillery barrage continued for 17 minutes. When it stopped, 6 men from 3rd Company were dead, 19 wounded. The wounded screamed for medics, cried for their mothers, begged God for mercy in 4 different languages. A 19-year-old German medic, himself only 3 months out of training, moved between casualties with morphine and bandages, performing triage with hands that shook. This was July 8th. The war would continue for nearly 4 more years. The technological reality of the Eastern Front announced itself dramatically on July 16th. Walther's company was supporting a German panzer advance when Soviet tanks appeared from a tree line 500 meters distant. The German Panzer IIIs and I-4s, which had dominated Polish and French armor, engaged immediately. Their shells struck the Soviet tanks dead center and bounced off. The German tank crew's radio transmissions, intercepted by company headquarters, revealed panic. "It's not penetrating! What are these things?" The Soviet tanks were T-34s, a design so superior to German armor that it would influence tank development for the rest of the war. Sloped armor that deflected shells, a 76.2mm gun that could destroy any German tank from a kilometer away, wide tracks that didn't bog down in mud, Christie suspension that allowed high speeds across rough terrain. German intelligence had known about T-34s since 1940, but had underestimated their numbers and performance. Now, in the summer heat of Ukraine, that intelligence failure cost lives. Wiking's anti-tank battalion, equipped with 37mm PaK-36 guns, faced the T-34s with weapons that crews bitterly called door knockers because their shells merely announced your presence without penetrating. The anti-tank crews tried shooting at tracks and viewing ports, the only vulnerable points. Finnish volunteers who'd fought Soviet tanks during the Winter War shared tactics. Let the T-34s pass, then shoot at thinner rear armor. It worked occasionally. More often, the light anti-tank guns were simply crushed as Soviet tanks rolled over positions. Desperation drove innovation. German engineers discovered that bundles of stick grenades jammed into track wheels could immobilize T-34s. Infantry learned to wait in foxholes, letting tanks pass, then climbing on them to drop grenades through engine hatches. These tactics required courage bordering on suicidal, and casualties were horrific. But they worked often enough that German forces survived the summer. The technological gap, however, was undeniable. By late July, Wiking had participated in encircling massive Soviet formations near Uman, trapping over 103,000 Red Army soldiers. The scale was difficult to comprehend. Prisoners marched past in columns that took hours to pass, heading to POW camps where conditions would kill hundreds of thousands. German propaganda filmed these victories, showing confident SS soldiers and defeated Soviets, proof of Aryan superiority. What the cameras didn't show was the exhaustion. Walther's company had started with 142 men. By July's end, they were down to 93. Not all casualties. Some were sick with dysentery, others suffering heat exhaustion, a few had psychological breakdowns and were evacuated. The 93 remaining men were filthy, exhausted, wearing uniforms stiff with sweat and dust. The elite training had prepared them for short, intense combat. No one had prepared them for continuous operations with minimal rest, advancing deeper into a country that seemed to have infinite reserves of men and space. The first Knight's Cross awarded to Wiking came on July 31st, to Obersturmführer Fritz Vogt, a German officer from Regiment Germania. Vogt had led a desperate attack against a Soviet bunker complex that was holding up the entire division's advance. With his platoon pinned down, by machine gun fire, Vogt circled alone through a ravine, approaching the main bunker from behind. He threw 6 grenades through the firing port, silencing the position, then rallied his men to capture the remaining bunkers. The action saved perhaps 100 lives and allowed the advance to continue. Himmler personally presented the decoration, using the ceremony to photograph himself with multinational soldiers for propaganda purposes. Vogt would survive the war and live until 1997, never publicly discussing whether his heroism that day was worth serving the regime he'd fought for. September brought the first serious doubts. Erich Walter sat with Lars Eriksson near a campfire outside Dnipropetrovsk, cleaning weapons and talking quietly. They had been in combat for 70 days. Eriksson had changed. The enthusiastic Norwegian who'd joked constantly during training now rarely smiled. He'd killed at least 6 Soviet soldiers in close combat, possibly more in long range. Firefights. He'd seen friends die. He'd witnessed atrocities against civilians and, though he hadn't participated, hadn't stopped them either. "Do you think we're winning?" Eriksson asked. Walter considered the question. They'd advanced 600 kilometers. They'd destroyed dozens of Soviet divisions. Every battle was a German victory. Yet the Red Army kept appearing with new divisions, new tanks, new artillery. The Soviet Union was enormous in ways maps couldn't convey. "I don't know," Walter admitted. Neither did anyone else, though no one dared say so publicly. The abyss they had entered in June had no visible bottom. October 6th, 1941, 0430 hours. The Mius River, southern Ukraine, Gefreiter Hans Müller, a Danish NCO commanding 3rd Squad, 1st Platoon, Westland Regiment, sat in an assault boat that rocked gently in the pre-dawn darkness. 11 other men crowded the boat with him, Belgians and Dutch mostly, clutching rifles and looking toward the opposite bank where Soviet positions waited. Behind them, German artillery prepared to fire a brief barrage before the crossing. Müller had studied the objective during yesterday's briefing, a bridgehead operation to establish positions on the Mius River's eastern bank, holding until engineers could build pontoon bridges for armor. Simple on paper, everyone knew it would be hell. The river here ran 40 meters wide, shallow enough to ford in places but deep enough that you'd drown wearing full equipment if you fell in. Soviet machine guns commanded every approach from concealed bunkers. At 0445, the artillery barrage began. At 0500, whistles blew. Müller's boat crew pushed off from the western bank and began rowing east. The crossing became a slaughter within minutes. Soviet artillery, pre-registered on the river, opened fire the moment the first boats entered the water. Shells exploded in the river itself, sending up geysers that swamped boats. Machine gun tracers crisscrossed the water, appearing beautiful and terrible simultaneously. Müller's boat was halfway across when a shell landed 5 meters to the left. The concussion wave flipped the boat, dumping all 12 men into the freezing October water. Müller went under, weighed down by equipment, touched the muddy bottom, pushed off, broke the surface gasping. Around him, men struggled and drowned. He saw a young Fleming, couldn't have been more than 18, go under and not resurface. Müller stripped off his pack and webbing, keeping only his rifle, and swam for the eastern bank. Bullets slapped the water around him. He reached the far side and pulled himself into cover behind a small embankment, lungs burning, hands numb from cold. Of his 12-man boat crew, 5 made it to the eastern bank. 7 drowned or were shot in the water. The bridgehead that first day was a nightmare of confined space and constant fire. Wiking Division had committed 2 regiments to the crossing, Westland and Nordland, roughly 4,000 men. By nightfall on October 6th, perhaps 2,000 had reached the eastern bank, establishing positions across a front only 800 meters wide and 200 meters deep. Soviet forces, elements of 9th Army reinforced by NKVD troops, counterattacked constantly. The bridgehead was so compressed that Soviet artillery didn't need to aim precisely. Any shell landing in the pocket would hit something. Müller spent October 7th in a foxhole that kept collapsing from near misses, sharing the space with a Norwegian volunteer named Olav Christensen. They took turns sleeping in 30-minute intervals, the non-sleeping man watching for Soviet infantry assaults. Food was whatever they'd carried in their pockets. Water came from shell craters, tasting of mud and chemicals. By October 8th, both men had dysentery but couldn't leave their position. The human cost escalated exponentially. Westland Regiment's 2nd Battalion, which had crossed with 731 men on October 6th, counted 312 men still combat effective by October 10th. Not all killed. Many were wounded, but evacuation across the river under fire was nearly impossible. The division's medical station on the eastern bank operated in a ravine, providing minimal cover from artillery. Doctors performed amputations with hacksaws, no anesthesia available. Wounded men screamed. Morphine ran out on October 9th. After that, seriously wounded soldiers received a pistol with 1 round and the choice to end their own suffering. A Norwegian doctor named Christian Berg later testified that he witnessed 15 men shoot themselves between October 9th and October 12th rather than endure their wounds without painkillers. Post-war, some historians disputed this testimony as Soviet propaganda. Russian archive access in the 2000s confirmed it through recovered German medical reports. Division d'Issour, headquarters, safely on the western bank, ordered the bridgehead held regardless of cost. Felix Steiner, who'd designed the division and prided himself on caring for his men, wanted to evacuate the bridgehead. 3rd Panzer Corps commander overruled him. The bridgehead had strategic value for future operations. Therefore, it would be held. Reinforcements continued crossing throughout October, replacing casualties that mounted daily. Hans Müller watched new arrivals, fresh-faced volunteers who'd just completed training, cross the river and die within hours. A Dutch replacement named Johannes de Vries joined Müller's squad on October 14th. He was 19 from Rotterdam, had volunteered in August believing he'd help defeat Bolshevism. De Vries lasted 6 hours before a Soviet sniper shot him through the chest. Müller and Christensen buried him in a shallow grave, marking it with his helmet on a stick. There was no ceremony. The war didn't pause for grief. The temperature dropped. As October progressed, transforming the bridgehead from hell to frozen hell. October 16th brought the first hard frost, temperatures falling to -2°C at night. Soldiers in the bridgehead were wearing summer uniforms. Winter equipment hadn't arrived. Men stuffed newspapers under their tunics for insulation. Frostbite casualties began appearing alongside combat wounds. Trench foot became epidemic among soldiers standing in waterlogged foxholes. The Meuse River began forming ice along its edges, making boat crossings even more dangerous. Soviet forces, better prepared for cold weather, intensified their attacks, knowing German combat effectiveness would decline as temperatures dropped. By October 18th, Wiking was receiving 120 casualties daily in the bridgehead, with only sporadic resupply getting through. The first mass desertion attempt happened October 27th. 23 Dutch volunteers from Westland Regiment's 3rd Company, including several who'd trained alongside Erich Walter in Senheim, decided they had had enough. In the pre-darkness, they left their foxholes and attempted to cross Soviet lines to surrender. Whether they shouted their intentions in Russian or German is unclear from records. What is clear is that Soviet forces opened fire, killing 19 immediately. 3 made it to Soviet positions and were taken prisoner, where they spent the rest of the war in camps near Siberia. 1 escaped back to German lines, where he was immediately arrested by Feldgendarmerie and executed for desertion on November 2nd. The executions were public, conducted in front of assembled battalion formations as deterrents. Standing in formation watching a Dutch volunteer shot by German military police, Hans Müller wondered what they were still fighting for. Soviet breakthrough nearly succeeded on October 24th. A dawn attack by 2 NKVD regiments, supported by T-34 tanks that simply rolled over German foxholes, penetrated 300 meters into the bridgehead. Westland Regiment's headquarters company found itself in hand-to-hand combat with Soviet infantry. A Norwegian company, outflanked and surrounded, fought its way out in close-quarters battle that killed 40% of the unit. Soviet tanks reached the riverbank itself before German engineers destroyed 2 with explosive charges placed directly on the hulls. The fighting that day was the most savage of the entire Meuse battle. No prisoners were taken by either side. When Soviet forces finally withdrew at dusk, German and Norwegian soldiers used flamethrowers to clear bunkers still holding out. The smell of burned flesh hung over the bridgehead for days. November 2nd brought relief, though at catastrophic cost. 1st Panzer Army finally called off the operation, ordering evacuation of the bridgehead after 27 days of continuous combat. The withdrawal was conducted over 2 nights, with rear guards holding positions while the majority crossed back to the western bank. Hans Müller's platoon, reduced to 17 men from its original 42, crossed on November 2nd, just before midnight. When they reached the western bank, they were given hot food for the first time in 3 weeks and told to rest. Müller sat with his remaining men, counting faces, doing mental arithmetic. Of the 142 men who'd been in his company on October 1st, 63 remained combat effective. 27 were confirmed dead. 39 wounded, 13 missing, almost certainly dead. The Meuse River bridgehead had destroyed 30% of Westland Regiment for no strategic gain whatsoever. The psychological impact was more devastating than the casualty statistics suggested. Soldiers who had believed in Germanic brotherhood and anti-Bolshevist crusade now believed only in survival. Mail from the period, intercepted by German censors and preserved in archives, reveals the transformation. Letters home went from patriotic declarations to quiet despair. A Danish volunteer wrote to his mother, "I don't know what we're fighting for anymore. I just want to live through tomorrow." A Fleming wrote, "They told us we were elite. Elite men don't die from artillery they can't see, fired by enemies who'll just be replaced by more enemies." Some volunteers maintained their ideological commitment, interpreting suffering as necessary sacrifice for the cause. But many experienced a crisis of faith from which they never recovered. The Meuse River broke something in Wiking Division that training and propaganda couldn't repair. They'd remain effective soldiers, but they'd never again be true believers. October 1941 was the end of innocence for Hitler's multinational crusade. December 15, 1941. Assembly area near Taganrog, 200 kilometers west of the Meuse River. Snow fell heavily as a train pulled into a siding where Wiking Division's remnants were reorganizing. Hauptsturmführer Dieter Schmidt, a German panzer officer recently assigned to Wiking, watched as flat cars unloaded their cargo, 12 Panzer III tanks fresh from factories in Germany. The tanks gleamed despite the weather, their short 50mm guns a massive upgrade over the 37mm weapons on earlier models. Schmidt's job was to train a battalion of SS soldiers, most of whom had never seen a tank up close, to become armored crewmen. As he watched volunteers approach the vehicles, with mixture of awe and uncertainty, Schmidt reflected on the strangeness of war. In France, he'd commanded experienced crews. Now he'd be teaching Norwegians and Danes the difference between a transmission and a turret ring. The Eastern Front devoured men and machines so quickly that experience became a luxury no one could afford. The transformation of Wiking from motorized infantry to Panzergrenadier Division represented both military necessity and political maneuvering. Militarily, the Eastern Front had proven that foot infantry, however well trained, couldn't keep pace with armored warfare's demands. Divisions needed organic tank support, self-propelled artillery, and armored personnel carriers to survive and exploit breakthroughs. The Wehrmacht was reorganizing its best infantry divisions accordingly, though chronic equipment shortages meant few divisions received authorized allotments. Politically, Heinrich Himmler saw an opportunity to elevate SS division status by equipping them comparably to Army Panzer divisions. If Waffen-SS divisions looked like elite formations on paper, they could claim elite status regardless of actual performance. Himmler lobbied Hitler personally for tank allocations, arguing that SS divisions' ideological reliability warranted preferential treatment. Hitler, skeptical of Wehrmacht generals after the failure to capture Moscow, agreed. Wiking would get armor. The equipment arrived, piecemeal throughout winter 1941 and spring 1942. 25 Panzer IIIs with 50mm guns, capable of penetrating T-34 armor at close range. 8 Panzer IVs with short 75mm guns, better suited for infantry support than tank duels. 12 Stuggy 3 assault guns, essentially turretless tanks with low silhouettes and excellent ambush capability. It was a fraction of the division's authorized strength, which called for a full battalion of 72 tanks plus assault gun battalion, but it was more armor than most Wehrmacht infantry divisions possessed. Additionally, the division received 300 new trucks, 50 half-tracks for mechanized transport, and captured Soviet vehicles by the hundreds. Soviet trucks, though mechanically unreliable, ran on gasoline so crude that German vehicles couldn't use it, making them paradoxically valuable. Maintenance crews learned to keep both German and Soviet vehicles operational, using cannibalized parts from destroyed equipment. Training revealed just how technically unprepared the volunteers were for mechanized warfare. Dieter Schmidt's tank crew candidates included Norwegian fishermen, Danish factory workers, and Dutch farmhands whose previous experience with machinery was limited to fishing boats or tractors. The Panzer III was exponentially more complex, a 20-ton vehicle with a 10-cylinder Maybach engine, 5-speed transmission, complex steering system, electrical turret traverse, radio equipment, and weapons systems. A competent crew required 4 specialists: driver, radio operator, machine gunner, gunner, and commander. Each role demanded months of training under normal circumstances. Schmidt had 6 weeks. He began with basics: how to start the engine without flooding it, how to shift gears without stripping them, how to read terrain to avoid bogging down. The Norwegian trainees, accustomed to boats, understood weight distribution intuitively. The Danes, many from industrial backgrounds, grasped mechanical systems quickly. The learning curve was brutal but manageable. Gunnery training exposed the life-and-death consequences of inadequate preparation. A Panzer III's 50mm KWK-38 gun could kill a T-34 at ranges up to 800 meters if you hit the right spot. That required understanding ballistics, leading moving targets, compensating for range and wind, and identifying vulnerable points on enemy armor in seconds. German panzer crews trained for 6 months on these skills. Schmidt's students got 2 weeks of live fire exercises with severely limited ammunition. One training accident killed 3 men when a round cooked off prematurely in a gun breech that hadn't been properly cleaned. Another nearly destroyed a tank when an inexperienced driver drove off a training ramp, breaking the suspension. Schmidt pushed anyway, knowing that inadequate training was better than none. When the division returned to combat in spring, his crews would face T-34s, operated by Red Army tankers who'd survived months of combat. The mortality rate would be horrific. Innovation emerged from necessity and desperation. Felix Steiner, watching exercises in February 1942, noticed that small mixed units of tanks, infantry, and engineers outperformed larger homogeneous formations. This contradicted Wehrmacht doctrine, which concentrated armor at division or corps level for breakthrough operations. Steiner instead created Kampfgruppen, battle groups of perhaps a dozen tanks, 2 infantry companies, an engineer platoon, and artillery forward observers, all trained to operate as integrated teams. The concept wasn't entirely new. German forces had used ad hoc Kampfgruppen throughout the war, but Steiner formalized it at company level, making combined arms warfare the default rather than exception. A Norwegian infantry company would permanently work with the same German tank platoon, learning each other's capabilities and limitations. When deployed, they'd fight as a single unit, rather than separate elements requiring coordination through division headquarters. The Soviet equipment captured during summer advances provided unexpected advantages alongside problems. Mechanics examining disabled T-34s discovered engineering solutions German designers hadn't considered. The T-34's Christie suspension, with large road wheels and no return rollers, was simpler and more reliable than German torsion bar systems. Its wide tracks distributed weight better, reducing ground pressure and improving mobility in mud and snow. The diesel engine, though less powerful than German gasoline engines, was far less likely to catch fire when hit and used fuel unavailable to German vehicles. Most impressive was the sloped armor, which deflected shots that would penetrate flat plates of similar thickness. German intelligence teams documented everything, sending detailed reports to Berlin. Some innovations would eventually appear in German designs, like the Panther tank, but the industrial capacity to implement widespread changes didn't exist. Germany could analyze Soviet superiority. It couldn't always match it. Personnel replacements arriving in winter brought both relief and concern. The division needed 4,200 men to compensate for Mias River losses and earlier casualties. Recruitment offices worked at overtime across occupied Europe, now accepting volunteers who would have been rejected in 1941. Standards dropped subtly. Eyesight requirements relaxed. Age limits extended from 30 to 35. Educational requirements reduced. The new arrivals included more Belgians, both Flemish and Walloon, as recruitment expanded beyond purely Nordic territories. They also included men whose motivations were less ideological and more practical. Belgium's economy was starving under occupation, and SS service provided steady food. The veterans eyed the newcomers skeptically, recognizing them as replacements for friends who'd died. Integration was imperfect. The shared suffering that had bonded original volunteers couldn't be replicated in training camps. But war was an efficient teacher, and those who survived their first weeks would become veterans themselves. Heinrich Himmler visited the division on February 23, 1942, conducting an inspection designed primarily for propaganda cameras. Accompanied by photographers and film crews, the Reichsführer SS reviewed formations of foreign volunteers and German officers, delivering a speech about racial destiny and Germanic brotherhood. He presented decorations to soldiers wounded at Meuse, though he didn't visit the hospitals where the most seriously wounded suffered. He toured the tank park, placing his hand on a Panzer III's armor while cameras rolled, creating imagery of SS technical superiority. He met with Felix Steiner, privately, promising additional equipment and priority for replacements. Whether these promises would materialize remained uncertain, but Himmler left satisfied that Wiking could be showcased as proof that Europe's best blood supported Hitler's crusade. The volunteers, standing in formation in freezing temperatures for 3 hours, were less impressed. April 15, 1942, marked the division's official redesignation, SS Panzergrenadier Division Wiking. The name change reflected organizational reality. This was now a mechanized formation with organic armor support, not leg infantry with trucks. The designation brought prestige within the SS hierarchy and theoretically higher priority for equipment. Practically, it meant little. The division still possessed only a fraction of authorized tanks. Most infantry still marched on foot because there weren't enough half-tracks or trucks to transport everyone. Artillery remained largely horse-drawn, using Soviet and Polish, horses captured during advances. But the designation mattered psychologically. For soldiers whose entire identity derived from being elite, the Panzergrenadier title validated their self-image. They weren't just another SS division, they were mechanized warriors of a new type of warfare. That this image exceeded reality bothered no one. On the Eastern Front, perception of strength was sometimes as valuable as strength itself, and Wiking would need every advantage, both real and imagined, for the battles ahead. June 28, 1942. Near Rostov-on-Don, dawn broke over the steppe as engines roared to life across a 20-kilometer front. Léon de Grelle, a Belgian Walloon volunteer serving with Wiking's reconnaissance battalion, stood in the hatch of his armored car, watching the sky lighten to the east. Behind his vehicle, columns of tanks and trucks stretched back kilometers, invisible in the pre-dawn darkness, but audible through the rumble of engines and rattle of tracks. Ahead, Soviet positions that intelligence claimed were lightly held. De Grelle had joined the SS only 3 months earlier, transferring from a Belgian volunteer legion after Himmler personally intervened to accept him, despite his lack of military experience. At 35, he was older than most volunteers, a former political leader whose fascist party had collaborated eagerly with German occupiers. He'd come east seeking glory and purpose. Now, as artillery began firing and orders crackled over the radio, he was about to discover what war actually felt like. Operation Blue, Hitler's 1942 summer offensive, aimed to capture the Caucasus oil fields and cut Soviet petroleum supplies. Army Group South would drive southeast through Rostov, cross the Don River, and advance into the Caucasus Mountains themselves. The plan was ambitious, bordering on fantastical. The distances involved were enormous. Supply lines would stretch over 1,000 kilometers, and Soviet resistance might collapse or might stiffen. But after the failure to capture Moscow in 1941, Hitler was fixated on economic warfare. If Germany could seize Soviet oil while denying it to the Red Army, perhaps strategic victory remained possible. Wiking Division, now reasonably recovered from Mias River losses and equipped with its partial tank allocation, was assigned to 1st Panzer Army's spearhead. Their mission: advance as rapidly as possible, bypass resistance, seize key terrain, and maintain momentum. The first 2 weeks were unlike anything the veterans had experienced. Instead of grinding attritional combat, they raced across the steppe at speeds of 30 to 50 kilometers per day. Soviet forces withdrew rather than standing to fight, implementing a strategy of trading space for time. Léon de Grelle's reconnaissance battalion operated ahead of the main force, scouting routes and reporting Soviet positions. The work was exhilarating and terrifying. Speed offered protection from artillery, but any wrong turn could drive them into ambush. On July 3rd, de Grelle's company encountered a Soviet cavalry unit that charged with sabers drawn, a surreal anachronism quickly ended by machine gun fire. On July 7th, they discovered an abandoned Soviet supply depot containing thousands of liters of fuel, tons of ammunition, and warehouses of food. The supplies suggested Soviet retreat was somewhat controlled, not a collapse. But the advance continued. Rostov-on-Don fell on July 23rd, after 4 days of brutal urban combat. The city of 500,000 sat astride the Don River, a natural defensive barrier and transportation hub. Soviet Ninth Army defended it tenaciously, fighting building by building. Wiking's Nordland Regiment led the assault into the city center, Norwegian and Danish volunteers clearing Soviet positions block by block. Urban warfare negated many advantages of the Panzergrenadier reorganization. Tanks were vulnerable in narrow streets, artillery couldn't be used without destroying the city, and every building potentially concealed machine guns or snipers. The fighting degraded into infantry pushing through rubble, throwing grenades into basements, shooting at muzzle flashes from upper stories. Eric Walter, now a platoon sergeant in Westland Regiment, later described Rostov as worse than Mias River, because at least in the bridgehead you could see your enemy. In the city, death came from everywhere and nowhere. The human cost in Rostov revealed itself through small details rather than statistics. A Norwegian corporal named Bjorn Larsen, fighting through an apartment block, entered a kitchen where a Soviet soldier and German volunteer had killed each other simultaneously in hand-to-hand combat. They'd died on the floor in each other's arms, struggling until blood loss claimed both. In another building, Danish volunteers found a Soviet field hospital the defenders had been unable to evacuate. 50 wounded Red Army soldiers lay on filthy mattresses, attended by 2 doctors and 3 nurses who'd stayed behind. The Geneva Convention theoretically protected medical personnel. SS directives treated Soviet medical staff as combatants. The Danish platoon leader radioed his company commander for instructions. After 20 minutes, he received orders. Evacuate the wounded through German lines to proper hospitals, take the doctors and nurses prisoner. Whether this represented humanity or pragmatism, no records indicate. But the Danish volunteers remembered it as one of the few moments in Rostov where they acted like soldiers rather than executioners. August brought the Caucasus proper, terrain that transformed warfare completely. The steppes' flat openness gave way to foothills, then mountains rising 3,000 meters. Forests replaced grasslands. Roads became mud tracks. The mechanization that had enabled rapid advances became a liability as tanks and trucks bogged down or couldn't navigate mountain paths. Wiking increasingly fought on foot, climbing slopes and securing passes while engineers struggled to improve supply routes. The environmental beauty was stunning. Snow-capped peaks, alpine meadows, clear streams. It was also strategically nightmarish. Every ridgeline offered defensive positions. Every valley became a potential kill zone. Soviet forces, withdrawing deeper into the mountains, could defend efficiently with small units positioned on high ground. On August 9th, Wiking's spearhead elements reached Mykop, site of significant oil fields 120 kilometers into the Caucasus. The capture was triumphant. Soldiers photographed themselves beside oil derricks, sending images home as proof of success. But Soviet engineers had done their work efficiently. Every well was sabotaged, machinery destroyed, storage facilities blown up. German petroleum specialists assessed that repairs would take months and require equipment Germany didn't have available. The Mykop fields, even when brought back online, produced only 15% of pre-war capacity. The entire justification for Operation Blue, capturing intact oil production, had failed at the first objective. Yet the advance continued another 100 kilometers toward Grozny's larger fields, chasing a strategic goal that was slipping away even as tactical victories mounted. September 2nd, near Mozdok, Leon de Grelle witnessed something that would haunt him for years. His reconnaissance unit had occupied a small town during the morning advance. By afternoon, Einsatzgruppe D, one of the SS mobile killing units operating behind the front lines, arrived. De Grelle watched as they assembled the town's Jewish population, perhaps 200 people, including children, in the town square. The Einsatzgruppe commander explained they were being relocated for security reasons. Instead, trucks drove them to a ravine 2 kilometers outside town. De Grelle didn't witness the executions directly, but he heard the machine gun fire continue for half an hour. When his unit moved through the area the next day, local witnesses described what had happened. This was the first time de Grelle, despite months of service in an SS division, personally confronted the regime's genocidal reality. He later claimed he felt horror. He also did nothing to intervene or report the killings. Neither did anyone else in his unit. The question of Wiking Division's proximity to and knowledge of Holocaust operations remains contentious and important. The division was a frontline combat unit, not an Einsatzgruppe or concentration camp guard formation. They weren't directly conducting mass murder of Jews in gas chambers or killing pits. However, they operated in the same territory as Einsatzgruppen, often just days or weeks ahead of the killing units. Soldiers witnessed roundups of Jews and other targeted groups. Some participated in anti-partisan operations that deliberately targeted Jewish civilians under pretext of security. Unit records, preserved in archives, include references to security operations and pacification actions that post-war research revealed were euphemisms for massacres. The extent of individual knowledge varied enormously. Some soldiers genuinely remained ignorant of the genocide's full scope. Others witnessed crimes directly, some participated. But the claim, made frequently by veterans in post-war years, that frontline SS divisions knew nothing about Nazi atrocities is demonstrably false. By late September, the advance ground to a halt 100 kilometers short of Grozny. Soviet resistance stiffened as defenders fell back on shorter supply lines, while German logistics stretched to breaking point. 1st Panzer Army, which had advanced over 615 kilometers in 3 months, simply ran out of fuel and ammunition simultaneously. Trucks that should have carried supplies forward were broken down or abandoned along the Siun route. Horses pulling artillery died from exhaustion and lack of fodder. The autumn rains began early, turning roads to mud that swallowed vehicles. Wiking Division, at the tip of the advance, found itself in an impossible position. Too far forward to receive supplies efficiently, not strong enough to advance further without support, but unable to retreat without admitting strategic failure. They dug defensive positions and waited. Erich Walter, now commanding what remained of his company, used the operational pause to reflect on how far they'd come and how meaningless the distance felt. They'd advanced from Ukraine to the Caucasus Mountains, roughly 800 kilometers in a straight line, though combat had covered much more. They'd destroyed countless Soviet units, captured tens of thousands of prisoners, seized territory the size of several European countries. And yet the Red Army continued appearing with fresh divisions. The war that was supposed to end with blitzkrieg victory had become an endless advance into vastness that absorbed everything Germany could commit. Sitting in a foxhole overlooking mountains that stretched to horizons, Walter finally understood what Soviet space meant. It meant Germany could win every battle and still lose the war. The realization was crushing and irrefutable, but orders were orders, and desertion meant execution. So, they held their positions and waited for winter. January 28, 1944. The Korsun-Cherkasy salient, central Ukraine. Oberscharführer Karl Nicolusy Lech, an Estonian platoon sergeant commanding 42 men from Nordland Regiment, crouched in a snow-filled trench watching the horizon. For 3 days, Soviet artillery had been intensifying, a sure sign that an offensive was coming. Behind the Estonian platoon, 3 kilometers west, lay the town of Korsun, where division headquarters had established temporary command. Behind Korsun, the road to Zvenegorodka and the rest of the German army. Ahead, east and north and south, Soviet forces of unknown but clearly massive strength. At 1100 hours, the artillery reached a crescendo. At 11:30, Nicolusy Lech's company commander radioed orders that would define the next 3 weeks. The Soviets had broken through in 2 locations simultaneously, encircling 56,000 German troops, including all of Wiking Division. They were cut off, no retreat authorized, hold and wait for relief. Nicolusy Lech looked at his platoon, men he'd trained and fought alongside for 8 months. None of them believed relief would come in time. The Cherkasy Pocket, also called the Korsun Pocket, was Hitler's latest strategic disaster in a war that had become a catalogue of disasters. After the Wehrmacht's catastrophic defeat at Kursk in summer 1943, the Eastern Front had transformed from German offensive to Soviet advance. The Red Army pushed west relentlessly, destroying Army Group Center and severely mauling Army Group South. Hitler's response to these reverses was to forbid retreat, declaring fortresses and vital positions that must be held regardless of encirclement risk. The salient around Cherkasy resulted from exactly this policy. German forces had clung to exposed positions because Hitler refused to authorize withdrawal to defensible lines. Now, Soviet 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts had executed a perfectly planned double envelopment, closing the trap on January 28th and leaving 2 German corps isolated in a pocket measuring roughly 15 kilometers by 30 kilometers. The trapped forces included Wiking Division, Viking Corps headquarters, and elements of 7 other divisions. They had ammunition for perhaps a week of heavy combat, food for 10 days on reduced rations, and virtually no fuel for vehicles. The first days inside the pocket were confusion masquerading as organization. Karl Nicolaus-Leck's platoon found themselves repeatedly repositioned as Soviet forces probed the perimeter searching for weak points. On January 30th, they defended a village against a battalion-strength Soviet attack, losing 9 men in 4 hours of combat before the attack was repulsed. On February 1st, they were pulled back to create a reserve, only to be committed again on February 3rd when Soviet armor broke through 2 kilometers south. The defense was improvised and desperate, engineers laying mines by hand in the path of advancing tanks, artillery firing over open sights at ranges of 500 meters, infantry with Panzerfaust rockets engaging T-34s they couldn't penetrate from the front. The pocket held because Soviet forces, overextended from their rapid advance, weren't organized for immediate exploitation. But every day, the perimeter contracted as casualties mounted and positions became untenable. Supply became the defining crisis even faster than expected. The Luftwaffe attempted aerial resupply using Ju-52 transport planes, but Soviet air defenses were overwhelming. Of 40 planes dispatched on February 4th, 14 were shot down before reaching the pocket. Of those that arrived, most dropped supplies inaccurately. Parachutes drifted outside the perimeter, delivering food and ammunition directly to Soviet forces. By February 8th, the division was rationing 200 grams of bread per man daily, roughly 2 thin slices. Ammunition was rationed to 20 rounds per rifle. Troops scavenged Soviet positions after firefights, taking weapons, food, and boots from the dead. The cold made hunger more dangerous. Men without sufficient calories couldn't maintain body heat. Frostbite casualties in early February exceeded combat casualties in some companies. The medical situation descended into horror. Wiking's field hospital, located in Cohesion, received wounded from across the pocket. By February 11th, 1,200 wounded men lay in buildings without heat, without adequate anesthesia or antibiotics, attended by doctors who'd worked without sleep for 72 hours. Dr. Henrik Berg, a Norwegian physician with the division since 1941, later described conditions. "We performed 30 amputations in a single day, mostly frostbite-damaged limbs. We had no anesthesia except vodka scavenged from Russian positions. Men had to be held down while we sawed through frozen flesh. The screaming never stopped. Those who survived surgery faced infection in unsanitary conditions. Those too seriously wounded to move were given morphine if any remained, a pistol if it didn't. The wounded understood the situation. The division couldn't evacuate them, and Soviet forces rarely took SS prisoners. Some chose suicide over capture, others simply waited to die. Temperature records for the pocket show why cold became as deadly as combat. February 11th through February 15th averaged -22°C overnight, dropping to -27 on February 13th. Soldiers had winter uniforms by early 1944, far better equipped than in 1941's winter. But winter gear assumes adequate food, shelters, and rest. Men existing on 400 calories daily, sleeping in snow-filled foxholes, wearing uniforms that hadn't been dry in weeks, couldn't maintain core temperature. Soviet forces, operating on interior lines with better logistics, rotated units out of the line for warm meals and rest. German troops stayed in position continuously. Frostbite claims toes first, then feet, then spreads up the leg if untreated. Men whose boots froze solid on their feet couldn't remove them to check for damage. By the time frostbite became visible, amputation was often the only treatment. Karl Nicolaus-Leck's platoon, which had 42 men on January 28th, had 29 combat effective by February 14th. The others were dead, wounded, or incapacitated by frostbite and exposure. Relief attempts from outside the pocket began February 4th and failed repeatedly. 1st Panzer Army organized Kampfgruppe Beike, built around the 3rd Panzer Division and including every available tank from surrounding formations. Their mission was to break through Soviet lines and establish a corridor for evacuating the pocket. They attacked south toward Cohesion, making initial progress against surprise Soviet defenders, advancing 20 kilometers in the first 2 days. Then Soviet reserves arrived, fresh divisions, T-34 brigades, artillery in quantities German forces could no longer match. The relief force got to within 15 kilometers of the pocket before being stopped. They could see signal flares from Cohesion at night, so close yet insurmountable. Herbert Otto Gille, Wiking's commander, radioed Baker's headquarters suggesting a coordinated breakout. The trapped divisions would attack south, while Baker's force attacked north, meeting in the middle. 1st Panzer Army denied. Authorization: pocket forces should hold and wait for relief. Another week passed with no progress. The decision to break out came on February 15th, made by Gille without authorization from higher command. 56,000 men couldn't be sustained on existing supplies. Relief wasn't coming quickly enough. Soviet forces were tightening the noose methodically. The breakout had to happen immediately or never. Gille's plan was brutally simple. At 0200 on February 16th, all mobile forces would attack southwest toward German lines, concentrating on a single 5-kilometer sector. They'd leave behind anything that couldn't move under its own power: trucks, artillery, supply vehicles, the seriously wounded. Every soldier would carry only weapons, ammunition, and one day's food. They'd march through the night, fighting through whatever Soviet forces blocked the path, until they reached German lines or died trying. It was desperation, not strategy. But desperation was all that remained. The breakout began at 0200 on February 16th, in temperatures of -25°C and darkness so complete men couldn't see 5 meters ahead. Wiking Division formed the spearhead with whatever tanks remained operational, perhaps a dozen Panthers and Panzer IVs. Behind them, infantry from multiple divisions moved in columns thousands strong, following the tanks by sound, since visibility was near zero. Soviet forces, surprised by the sudden assault in weather no sane commander would choose for offensive operations, initially fell back. The German column advanced 4 kilometers in the first hour, overrunning Soviet positions that never saw them coming. Then Soviet commanders realized what was happening and began responding. Artillery fire fell randomly across the route of advance, shells exploding in masses of men who couldn't disperse or take cover in the darkness. Machine guns fired blindly at the sound of engines and boots. The advance became a desperate charge, soldiers running toward where they hoped German lines existed. Karl Nicolaus-Lek's platoon moved in the second wave behind Wiking's tanks. The darkness was absolute except when shells exploded, creating momentary freezing tableaus of men running, falling, crawling. Sound was overwhelming. Tank engines, artillery detonations, small arms fire, men screaming in a dozen languages. They crossed a frozen stream, ice cracking under their weight, waist-deep in water that would kill from hypothermia in minutes. Nicolaus-Lek pulled 2 men from the water, left 3 others who went under and didn't resurface. They climbed the opposite bank and kept running. At some point near dawn, the Soviet firing intensified, then suddenly stopped. They'd broken through the encirclement. German artillery fired star shells, marking friendly lines. Soldiers who had been running in terror suddenly stopped, collapsing in the snow from exhaustion. They'd escaped, but at costs that would only become clear in daylight. The breakout cost everything the trapped divisions possessed and a third of their men. Of 56,000 soldiers encircled on January 28th, approximately 35,000 reached German lines by February 17th. 20,000 were dead, captured, or missing. Wiking Division, which had entered the pocket with 11,000 men, got out 6,200. Karl Nicolaus-Lek's platoon, 42 strong on January 28th, numbered 7 men on February 17th. All tanks, assault guns, artillery pieces, and vehicles, except a few dozen trucks, were abandoned. The seriously wounded were left behind, given morphine and pistols, and told to do what they thought best. Some Soviet units took prisoners, others executed SS wounded on sight. The breakout's success was relative. They had avoided annihilation, but destroyed themselves as combat formations in the process. Herbert Otto Gille was awarded the Oak Leaves II, his Knight's Cross, for leading the breakout. Soldiers who had marched through the frozen nightmare were too exhausted and traumatized to care about decorations. They'd survived. Everything else was irrelevant. March 12, 1944. Lille, France, occupied territory far from the Eastern Front. Hauptsturmführer Jan Monk, a Flemish SS recruiting officer, sat in an office that had once belonged to a French textile merchant, interviewing volunteers for Wiking Division. The young man across the desk, named Franz de Klerk, was 17 years old, claimed to be 19, and wanted to fight Bolshevism to protect Europe. Monk had conducted this interview dozens of times recently, and each iteration depressed him more. De Klerk wasn't a volunteer in any meaningful sense. He was fleeing. His father had been an enthusiastic collaborator, working with German authorities since 1940. Now, with Allied invasion obviously imminent and Belgian resistance growing bolder, the Zoll family faced execution as collaborators when liberation came. Joining the SS offered de Klerk safety from Belgian justice, and his family some hope he'd survive the war in a POW camp, rather than before a firing squad. Monk knew this. He also knew that Wiking Division, devastated at Cherkasy, needed 4,000 replacements immediately and couldn't afford to ask too many questions about motivation. The reconstitution of Wiking Division in spring 1944 revealed the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS's existential personnel crisis. Germany had mobilized every possible man, stripping industries and agriculture of workers to feed the insatiable front lines. The pool of German men aged 18 to 45 was nearly exhausted. The Waffen-SS, which had recruited from Germany's best blood in the war's early years, now accepted recruits Wehrmacht medical boards had rejected. But divisions like Wiking had an alternative source: foreign recruitment from occupied territories. The problem was that by 1944, volunteer was often a euphemism. The genuine ideological volunteers, men who'd believed in Germanic brotherhood and anti-Bolshevik crusade, had largely already joined or been killed. New recruits were conscripts, collaborators fleeing retribution, or desperate men from regions where SS service was better than starvation. The Baltic recruitment revealed the moral complexity most starkly. Estonia and Latvia, occupied by Soviets in 1940, then Germans in 1941, then facing Soviet reconquest in 1944, provided thousands of recruits. Estonian recruitment officer Eduard Lassmann described the process. "We didn't ask if men wanted to join the SS. We told them the Soviets were coming back, and what that would mean: deportations to Siberia, execution of anyone who'd collaborated with Germans, total occupation. The SS offered the possibility of defeating the Bolsheviks, or at least dying fighting, instead of being shot. In a basement by NKVD, these weren't volunteers by any normal definition. They were condemned men choosing how they'd face their fate." Between February and May 1944, approximately 4,000 Estonian men joined Wiking and other SS divisions, another 3,000 Latvians. Their motivation wasn't Nazi ideology, it was terror of Soviet vengeance. Training standards collapsed proportionally to recruitment desperation. Pre-war Wehrmacht infantry training had lasted 6 months. In 1941, when Wiking's original volunteers trained, they received 16 weeks of intensive preparation. By spring 1944, replacement training lasted 6 to 8 weeks for infantry, as little as 4 weeks for some support roles. The training that occurred focused on immediate combat skills: how to fire a rifle, throw a grenade, dig a foxhole, identify Soviet tanks. There was no time for ideological indoctrination, combined arms exercises, or building unit cohesion. Men went from civilian life to frontline trenches in 2 months. Unsurprisingly, casualties among replacements were catastrophic. A soldier's most dangerous period was his first month of combat, when inexperience and naivety made him vulnerable to threats veterans avoided instinctively. 1944 replacements often died within their first week. The equipment situation was paradoxically better than the personnel quality. German industry, despite strategic bombing, was reaching peak production in early 1944 through ruthless efficiency and slave labor. Wiking received 79 tanks for reconstitution, the best equipment allocation they'd had during the entire war. 35 Panther medium tanks with long 75mm guns that could finally match T-34s, 27 Panzer IV medium tanks, and 17 Stu G assault guns. They also received new armored personnel carriers, trucks, and self-propelled artillery. On paper, Wiking was stronger than ever. The problem was the crews. Panther tanks required skilled drivers. The transmission was notoriously fragile, and improper shifting would destroy it within a few days. New crews received perhaps 3 weeks of training on Panthers. Experienced tankers needed 6 months to master the vehicle fully. The division's tank regiment spent as much time repairing self-inflicted mechanical damage as they did preparing for combat. Franz de Klerk completed his abbreviated training in late April, and was assigned to Westland Regiment's 2nd Company. On his first day with the unit, a veteran corporal named Johann Vermeer conducted the real orientation. Vermeer had survived Meuse River, Caucasus, Cherkasy, and 2 years of combat. He was 24 but looked 40. His advice was blunt. Don't volunteer for anything. Don't be a hero. Keep your head down. Trust the men next to you. Don't trust officers who haven't been wounded at least once. Never take shelter in a building that hasn't been cleared. When you hear artillery, count 5 seconds after the explosion before you move. They fire in patterns. Drink every chance you get. Not alcohol, water. Dehydration kills more men than you'd think. If you get separated, head west. The Russians don't take SS prisoners. Questions? De Klerk had 1,000 questions but voiced none. Vermeer nodded. Good. You'll probably die in the next month. If you survive, you'll understand everything I just said. The age demographics of the reconstituted division were disturbing. In 1941, the average volunteer was 26, a mature man with work experience and developed judgment. By mid-1944, the average age had dropped to 21. 18% of replacements were under 18 years old, boys whose parents had signed waivers allowing early military service or who'd lied about their ages. The oldest volunteers were now in their late 30s, men previously considered too old for combat. Units. This age compression affected everything. Discipline problems increased as teenagers rebelled against authority. Medical issues multiplied as older men couldn't handle the physical demands. Combat effectiveness suffered because units lacked the mixture of youthful energy and veteran wisdom that characterized effective formations. Some companies consisted entirely of recruits with fewer than 3 months' service, commanded by officers who had been promoted because every superior had been killed. The motivations of 1944 recruits, when they could articulate them, reflected the war's trajectory. A Danish replacement named Klaus Petersen, interviewed decades later, explained, "I didn't join because I believed in Hitler or Nazism. Denmark was occupied, and I'd collaborated by working for the Germans. When the Allies invaded France in June, everyone knew Germany would lose. I knew I'd face Danish justice as a collaborator, probably execution. The SS offered a chance to survive as a prisoner of war if I surrendered to the Americans or British. Also, honestly, the pay was better than anything else available. It wasn't ideology, it was survival." This calculus was shared by thousands, betting that SS service offered better survival odds than staying home to face retribution as collaborators. By June 20th, 1944, Wiking Division was declared combat ready with a paper strength of 19,500 men. In reality, perhaps 12,000 were genuinely fit for combat operations. The remainder were too old, too young, too poorly trained, or too recently arrived to be reliable under fire. The division's officer corps had similarly degraded. 40% of company commanders had fewer than 6 months' experience in their positions because their predecessors were dead or wounded. The NCO situation was even worse. Experienced sergeants were irreplaceable, and their loss in Cherkasy created a leadership vacuum filled by men promoted before they were ready. The division that assembled in Poland in June 1944 bore little resemblance to the ideological volunteers of 1941. They were an organization held together by structure and desperation, not belief. How they would perform when committed to combat would test whether organizational discipline could substitute for individual motivation. The final irony of the Reconstitution was that as the division's quality declined, its equipment improved. On paper, with 79 tanks, mechanized infantry, and full allocation of artillery, Wiking looked like a formidable armored formation. In practice, poorly trained crews couldn't extract full value from sophisticated weapons. A Panther tank operated by a veteran crew was devastating. A Panther operated by a crew with 3 weeks training was a liability, prone to mechanical breakdown, likely to misidentify targets, and unable to use terrain effectively. The division's own intelligence. Officer noted in a report preserved in archives, "We possess the finest equipment the Reich can provide, operated by soldiers who barely understand how to use it, commanded by officers learning through catastrophe. We are a paper tiger with real claws, but no idea how to use them. God help us when we meet the Soviets again." God did not help them. Neither did equipment, nor organization, nor increasingly desperate courage. The Eastern Front had become a machine that consumed armies, and Wiking was about to be fed into its gears once more. August 5, 1944. Warsaw, Poland. Hauptsturmführer Friedrich Weber, commanding a company of Panther tanks from Wiking's 5th Panzer Battalion, watched the city burn from his turret hatch 3 kilometers away. The uprising had begun 4 days earlier when the Polish Home Army, believing the approaching Red Army would support them, rose against German occupation. Instead, Soviet forces had halted on the Vistula River's east bank, within artillery range, but offering no assistance, content to watch the Germans and Poles destroy each other. Wehrmacht and SS units had been pulled from across Poland to suppress the revolt, including elements of Wiking Division, just finishing Reconstitution. Weber's orders were simple and horrifying: support infantry clearing operations in the city's districts, destroy fortified positions, and show no mercy to partisans. Weber had fought across the Eastern Front for 3 years. He'd killed Soviet soldiers by the dozens, destroyed tanks, shelled villages. But this was different. These were civilians, fighting in their own capital city, and he was ordered to kill them methodically. The military situation in Warsaw was complex beyond simple German forces versus Polish resistance dynamics. The Polish Home Army, numbering roughly 40,000 fighters, controlled large sections of the city and had established a functioning provisional government. They weren't poorly armed partisans. They had seized German supply depots, captured weapons, and organized into military formations with proper command structure. They controlled hospitals, communications, and supply lines within their areas. German forces, initially surprised by the uprising's scale, responded by deploying 9 infantry divisions, additional police units, and SS formations, including Durlawanger and Kaminsky brigades, notorious for brutality. The German strategy was straightforward: isolate each district, destroy resistance systematically, evacuate civilians or kill them indistinguishably from fighters, then demolish the district entirely. Warsaw wouldn't just be recaptured, it would be erased. Wiking's specific role involved tank-supported attacks in several districts during August and September. Friedrich Weber's company operated primarily in Wola and Ochota districts on the city's western edge. The combat was nothing like open-field warfare. Tanks advanced down streets swept clean of obstacles by infantry, then provided fire support to clear fortified buildings. A typical engagement: Polish fighters had fortified an apartment building with machine guns covering the street. Weber's Panthers would position at street corners, fire high explosive shells through windows at point-blank range until the building collapsed or caught fire, then move to the next position. The civilian casualties were immense and largely unavoidable. Warsaw's population hadn't been evacuated. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were trapped in the combat zone, used as human shields by Polish fighters or simply caught between belligerents. The Ochota District Massacre remains Wiking's most controversial Warsaw operation. On August 12th through 14th, German forces including Wiking tank units and Durlwanger Brigade infantry conducted pacification operations that killed an estimated 10,000 civilians. The precise involvement of Wiking soldiers is disputed. Some sources claim Wiking tanks provided support while Durlwanger conducted executions. Other sources, including Polish survivor testimony and post-war German court records, place Wiking infantry directly participating in roundups and shootings. The Nazi legal framework considered armed civilians Francs-Tireurs, illegal combatants not protected by laws of war, and authorized summary execution of anyone suspected of resistance activity. This framework was applied broadly and deliberately. Entire apartment buildings were cleared by executing all occupants. No trials, no distinction between fighters and civilians. Whether individual Wiking soldiers pulled triggers or merely provided security while others murdered thousands is a distinction that matters morally but perhaps not practically. Norwegian volunteer Thormod Christiansen participated in Warsaw operations with Nordland Regiment and kept a diary later discovered by researchers. His August 14th entry, ordered to secure a perimeter while police units conducted security operation in apartment complex, could hear shooting for 2 hours, hundreds of shots. When we advanced into the complex after they finished, found bodies everywhere, women, children, elderly, not soldiers. Officers said they were sheltering partisans, maybe true, probably not, felt sick, said nothing. What could I say? This is what we've become. Christiansen survived the war and emigrated to Canada, where he worked as a carpenter until his death in 1979, never publicly discussing his SS service. His diary was found in an estate sale and donated to a military museum. The technical challenges of urban combat forced innovations later studied by military historians. The Panther tank, designed for open-field engagements at ranges of 1 to 2 kilometers, had to operate in streets where combat occurred at 50 to 100 meters. The long 75mm gun, optimized for anti-tank roles, was used for direct fire against buildings, an inefficient scenic application. Crews learned to aim high-explosive shells at building foundations, causing structural collapse rather than trying to clear room by room. They also learned to fear Polish Molotov cocktails and captured Panzerfaust rockets, both of which could destroy a tank in close quarters where the crew couldn't see attackers approaching. Weber's company lost 3 Panthers in Warsaw, all to infantry anti-tank weapons at ranges under 50 meters. The crews, trapped in burning tanks on narrow streets, mostly died. 2 survivors, both severely burned, were recovered by infantry. 1 died of injuries within hours. The other survived and spent the rest of the war in a hospital. The psychological impact on Wiking soldiers varied enormously based on personal experience and moral framework. Some, particularly those with strong ideological commitment, rationalized the violence as necessary counter-terror against partisan warfare. The Nazi propaganda framework provided justification. Poles were racially inferior Slavs conducting illegal resistance against legitimate German authority. Therefore, harsh measures were required to restore order. Other soldiers, perhaps the majority, simply compartmentalized. They followed orders, did what was required, and avoided thinking too deeply about implications. A minority experienced genuine moral crisis. Franz de Klerk, the young Flemish replacement who joined in March, witnessed a German police unit execute 30 Polish civilians, mostly women and elderly, accused of hiding weapons. He wrote to his family, "I joined to fight communism, not murder grandmothers. This isn't war. I don't know what it is, but it's not what they told us in Belgium." His letter was intercepted by military censors and resulted in disciplinary action for defeatism. He was reassigned to the Eastern Front, where his moral concerns became irrelevant amid the broader carnage. The uprising's eventual outcome validated Soviet strategic cynicism. By allowing Germans to suppress the resistance while Red Army forces waited across the river, Stalin ensured that Polish forces capable of an independent action would be destroyed. When Soviet forces finally entered Warsaw in January 1945, they encountered a devastated city and weakened Polish movement, unable to resist Soviet domination. 16,000 Polish fighters had died, 150 to 200,000 civilians were dead, and 85% of the city was destroyed. German forces lost approximately 17,000 killed and wounded, including 216 Wiking soldiers confirmed dead. The military result was German victory at tremendous cost. The strategic result was Soviet victory achieved through calculated abandonment of allies. Post-war, Warsaw became central to arguments about Waffen-SS criminality. Prosecutors at German war crimes trials used Wiking's participation in suppressing the uprising to demonstrate that frontline SS divisions, not just Einsatzgruppen or camp guards, committed atrocities. Defense lawyers countered that Wiking fought against armed partisans in lawful military operations, and that any civilian deaths resulted from the fog of war, not intentional massacres. The truth, as preserved in documents and testimony, fell between extremes. Wiking fought militarily legitimate battles against home army forces, but also participated in and provided support for operations that deliberately targeted civilians or failed to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Whether this constituted war crimes depends partly on legal definitions and partly on moral frameworks. Under modern international humanitarian law, much of what occurred in Warsaw, 1944, would constitute crimes against humanity. Under Nazi military law, it was authorized counter-partisan warfare. The soldiers themselves, from Friedrich Weber to Franz de Klerk to Thormod Christiansen, had to decide individually what they'd participated in and whether they could live with that knowledge. Some could, some couldn't. None could undo what had been done. October 29, 1944. Lake Balaton region, Hungary. Lieutenant R.V. Paavola, an Estonian company commander with Wiking's Narva battalion, watched Soviet tanks approach across farmland that should have been preparing for winter harvest. Instead, the fields were burning, set ablaze by retreating Hungarian troops. The T-34s advanced in a line of perhaps 20 vehicles, supported by infantry that Pavola's binoculars revealed as fresh troops, uniforms clean, moving with discipline suggesting recent training. His company, holding a village on the Balaton defensive line, numbered 97 men with 2 PaK-40 anti-tank guns, no armor support, and ammunition for perhaps 2 hours of heavy combat. They'd been in Hungary 3 weeks, rushed from Warsaw to block Soviet advances that threatened to cut off all German forces in the Balkans. The assignment was described as temporary. Everyone knew it was terminal. The only question was how long they'd survive before the Red Army swept over them. Hungary, in autumn 1944, represented the Wehrmacht's last attempt to hold strategic territory in southeastern Europe. Hungary was Germany's final major ally after Italy's surrender and Romania's defection. Hungarian oil fields at Nagykanizsa, though modest compared to Soviet production, were among the last petroleum sources Germany controlled. Budapest was a major industrial center and transportation hub. Most critically, Hungary provided buffer space. Losing Hungary meant Soviet forces would directly threaten Austria and southern Germany. Hitler demanded Hungary be defended regardless of cost. Wiking Division, despite having spent months reconstituting after Cherkasy and weeks in Warsaw, was thrown into Hungarian defensive operations with inadequate preparation. They were among Germany's more experienced and better equipped formations, making them natural candidates for crisis deployments. This reasoning made strategic sense but ignored a fundamental reality. Even elite units have breaking points. The operational tempo in Hungary was relentless from the start. Soviet forces, having shattered Romanian and Bulgarian armies, advanced with overwhelming numerical superiority. 4 Soviet divisions to every German division, 6-to-1 advantage in armor, near total air superiority. Wiking fought delaying actions, holding positions for a day or two before withdrawing to avoid encirclement, then establishing new defensive lines and repeating the process. Arvi Paavola's company conducted this exhausting cycle 13 times in November alone. They'd occupy a village or hilltop, dig in, fight off Soviet probes, hold against a major assault until flanking positions collapsed, receive withdrawal orders, abandon positions they'd bled to hold, march through the night to the next defensive line, and start again. There was no rest, no time for maintenance, minimal resupply. Men existed on 4 hours of sleep daily, eating captured Soviet rations supplemented with whatever Hungarian civilians could provide. The relief attempts to break the Budapest encirclement exemplified strategic insanity masquerading as military necessity. By December 24th, Soviet forces had surrounded Budapest, trapping 35,000 German and Hungarian troops. Hitler ordered immediate relief operations, assigning Wiking and 3 other divisions to break through. The objective was militarily impossible. The encircling Soviet forces were too strong, the relief divisions too weak, and the distance too great. But Hitler's orders weren't suggestions. On January 1st, 1945, Wiking attacked north toward Budapest from positions near Lake Velence. They advanced 23 kilometers in 4 days, destroying 2 Soviet rifle divisions and creating genuine hope that relief might succeed. Then Soviet reserves arrived, 3 tank brigades, 5 rifle divisions, and artillery in quantities that turned daylight dark with smoke. The relief offensive ground to a halt 15 kilometers short of Budapest's perimeter. The human cost of the relief attempts surpassed anything Wiking had experienced except Cherkasy. Frans de Klerk, the Flemish volunteer who joined in spring, died on January 7th during an assault on a fortified village. His platoon advanced across open ground against machine guns they couldn't suppress. De Klerk made it 30 meters before a burst of fire cut him down. No one recovered his body. The platoon fell back, and Soviet forces occupied the ground by nightfall. His parents, back in Belgium, received notification of his death in February. They never learned exactly where or how he died, only that he had been killed in action in Hungary. 7 months of SS service from recruitment to death. He was 17 years old, 18 according to forged documents that allowed early service. He's buried in a mass grave somewhere near Lake Valence, unmarked and unidentified. The tank losses were catastrophic and irreplaceable. Wiking had deployed to Hungary with 79 tanks. By late January, 45 were destroyed or abandoned due to mechanical failure and lack of spare parts. German industry was still producing tanks, but fuel shortages meant many never reached front lines. Those that arrived often came without trained crews. Veterans were dead or wounded. Replacements had minimal training. A Panther tank, Germany's best armored vehicle, required a crew of 5: commander, gunner, loader, driver, radio operator. Training a competent crew took 6 months. By early 1945, crews received 4 weeks of training at most. The result was predictable. Technical superiority meant nothing when crews didn't know their vehicle's capabilities, couldn't perform basic maintenance, or panicked under fire. Soviet South. Tankers, often operating technically inferior but mechanically reliable T-34s, destroyed German armor through superior crew coordination and numbers. The Estonian volunteers faced unique pressures that transcended military defeat. Estonia had been occupied by Soviets in 1940, liberated by Germans in 1941, and was now being reconquered by the Red Army. Every Estonian in Wiking Division knew what Soviet occupation meant. Their families would face deportation to Siberia, execution as collaborators, or at best, brutal interrogation. They were fighting not for German victory, which everyone knew was impossible, but to delay Soviet advance long enough for their families to flee west. Arvi Paavola wrote to his wife in December, "I don't expect to survive. I don't fight for Hitler or Germany. I fight so you have time to reach the American zone. Take the children and go. Don't wait for me." She received this letter in January, fled westward with their 3 children, and reached Bavaria in March. Paavola survived the war, barely, in the Bavaria, and reunited with his family in 1946. Thousands of Estonian families weren't as fortunate. February brought the final failure at Budapest and the start of unrestricted retreat. On February 13th, the Budapest garrison attempted a breakout after 51 days of encirclement. Of 35,000 troops, fewer than 700 reached German lines. The rest were killed or captured. Wiking Division, which had sacrificed thousands trying to relieve Budapest, achieved nothing except its own devastation. By February 20th, the division had fewer than 11,000 combat-effective soldiers from the 19,500 deployed to Hungary in October. They'd lost 62 tanks, 180 artillery pieces, over 400 trucks and support vehicles. They'd inflicted heavy casualties on Soviet forces, destroying hundreds of tanks and killing thousands of enemy soldiers. None of it mattered strategically. The Red Army had unlimited reinforcements. Germany didn't. Each battle Germany won pushed them closer to losing the war. The civilians caught in this fighting experienced horrors that purely military histories often overlook. Hungarian villages became battlegrounds repeatedly as lines shifted. German forces would occupy a village, fortify it, fight off Soviet attacks, withdraw. Soviet forces would occupy the ruins, establish their own defenses, face German counterattacks, perhaps be pushed out temporarily. The civilians, caught between armies, faced violence from all sides. German troops requisitioned food and shelter, sometimes at gunpoint. Soviet troops, particularly rear echelon units, committed systematic rape and looting. Hungarian civilians, uncertain which side would ultimately control their country, tried to avoid antagonizing either. Many fled toward Austria or Germany, becoming refugees. Others hid in cellars, waiting for the violence to pass over them. Thousands died from starvation, disease, or being caught in crossfire. Their deaths went unrecorded, nameless casualties of a war fought across their farmland. By late February, everyone from division commanders to private soldiers understood the fundamental futility of their situation. Soviet forces outnumbered them 5-1 in infantry, 6-1 in armor, and possessed total air superiority. Every position held today would be abandoned tomorrow. Every successful defense merely delayed inevitable defeat. Yet the fighting continued because no one could imagine an alternative. Desertion meant execution, if caught by Feldgendarmerie, or uncertain fate if captured by Soviets. Surrender as a unit wasn't authorized. Hitler had forbidden capitulation without his explicit permission, which would never come. The only option was to keep fighting, not for victory, but from institutional momentum, organizational discipline, and the absence of any imaginable alternative. They were trapped in a war that was over for everyone except those still dying in it. March 6th, 1945. 0430 hours. Southwest of Lake Balaton, Hungary. Oberscharführer Henrik Larsson, a Norwegian tank commander, sat in his Panther's turret watching condensation form on the inside of his periscope. Outside, in pre-dawn darkness, 800 German tanks were assembled for Operation Frühlingserwachen, Spring Awakening, Hitler's final offensive on the Eastern Front. Larsson had commanded this same Panther since January. Miraculous survival, given that average tank lifespan in combat was measured in days. His crew, all Norwegian volunteers from Nordland Regiment, had been together for 7 months, which made them veterans by 1945 standards. They would fought across Hungary throughout winter, and now they were assigned to the spearhead of an offensive everyone knew was strategically pointless. The objective, as explained in yesterday's briefing, was to recapture Hungarian oil fields and destroy Soviet forces south of Lake Balaton. The actual objective, understood by everyone except perhaps Hitler himself, was to die attacking rather than defending. The operational plan for Frühlingserwachen reflected Hitler's complete detachment from military reality. 6th SS Panzer Army, including Wiking Division, would attack from north of Lake Balaton toward the Danube River, approximately 60 kilometers. 2nd Panzer Army would attack from south of the lake, creating a massive encirclement of Soviet forces in between. Once these forces were destroyed, German armies could stabilize the southern front and potentially negotiate a separate peace with Western allies. This fantasy required ignoring multiple obvious problems. German forces had fuel for perhaps 100 kilometers of sustained operations, not enough for an offensive and subsequent exploitation. Soviet forces defending the sector were fresh divisions, from strategic reserves, not the depleted units German intelligence estimated. The spring thaw had begun early, turning Hungarian plains into seas of mud that would bog down heavy armor. And most fundamentally, Germany was losing the war on all fronts simultaneously. A local offensive success, even if achieved, would delay defeat by perhaps weeks. The assault began at precisely 0430 with an artillery barrage from 600 guns. Henrik Larsson's Panther, designated as lead tank in his company's assault, crossed the start line at 0500. For the first hour, everything proceeded according to plan. Soviet defensive positions, surprised by the scale and timing of the attack, fell back. Larsson's company advanced 4 kilometers before encountering serious resistance. The landscape was surreal in the dawn light. Burning vehicles from preliminary artillery strikes, abandoned trenches, scattered equipment from retreating Soviet units. By 0800, Larsson's company had captured a Soviet supply depot intact, discovering enough ammunition and fuel to supply a division. The find was encouraging and also terrifying. If the Soviets could afford to abandon such quantities, what did that say about their overall resources? The initial penetration reached 30 kilometers by March 8th, the deepest German advance in 6 months. Norwegian and Danish infantry from Nordland Regiment captured multiple villages, taking thousands of Soviet prisoners and destroying defensive positions that intelligence had claimed were impregnable. Wiking's Panzer Battalion, including Larsson's company, punched through 3 defensive lines, encircling and destroying elements of 2 Soviet rifle divisions. For 2 days, the offensive resembled 1941's Blitzkrieg victories, rapid advances, disorganized enemy, dramatic tactical successes. Veterans who had survived years of retreat finally experienced the intoxication of attacking successfully. Some allowed themselves to believe, briefly, that perhaps Germany could still achieve something other than total defeat. The delusion lasted 48 hours before reality intervened. March 12th brought the spring rains that meteorologists had predicted and commanders had ignored. 24 hours of heavy rainfall transformed Hungarian farmland into quagmire. The Panther tank, weighing 45 tons, sank in mud that hadn't been problematic 2 days earlier. Larsson's company, advancing toward its next objective, bogged down completely by 0900. All 12 Panthers in the company were immobilized, treads churning uselessly in mud up to their drive sprockets. Recovery vehicles, equally bogged down, couldn't reach them. The tanks became stationary artillery platforms, unable to maneuver or retreat. Soviet artillery, repositioning after its initial retreat, now had stationary targets. The first shells began falling on Larsen's position at 1000 hours. By 1300, 3 Panthers and his company had been destroyed, crews killed by direct hits they couldn't escape because the vehicles couldn't move. Larsen's tank survived only because it was in slight defilade, shielded by a small rise. But they weren't going anywhere. The Soviet counteroffensive launched on March 16th was overwhelming in scale and speed. Having allowed the German offensive to advance into exposed positions, Soviet command committed 5th Guards Tank Army, 407 tanks fresh from strategic reserves, supported by 15 rifle divisions that hadn't been identified by German intelligence. The Guards tankers were Soviets' best, experienced crews in late-model T-34-85s, coordinated by competent officers, backed by artillery in quantities that seemed infinite. They struck Wiking's exposed northern flank with such force that the entire assault collapsed within hours. Henrik Larsen's company, immobilized in the mud, received orders to abandon their tanks and withdraw on foot. Of 12 Panthers, only 3 could be recovered once the mud dried weeks later. The remainder were destroyed in place to prevent capture. Larsen and his crew escaped on foot, carrying only personal weapons, walking 30 kilometers back to German lines through rain and Soviet artillery. They'd survived, again, but their tank was gone. The human cost of the offensive emerged in casualty reports that understated reality. Wiking Division officially lost 2,167 killed and 4,890 wounded in 19 days, 39% casualties in less than 3 weeks. But these numbers didn't capture the complete picture. Hundreds more were missing, presumed dead or captured. Others were too physically and psychologically exhausted to continue, even if technically unwounded. The division's effective combat strength, 19,000 men on paper, was perhaps 8,000 after Frühlingsrewachen. They'd destroyed their offensive capability for a 40-kilometer advance that was reversed in 4 days. Every meter gained was lost. Every enemy position captured was recaptured. Every tactical victory reversed by strategic defeat. The psychological impact on survivors transcended mere exhaustion. Veteran soldiers who had maintained discipline through years of retreat experienced something worse during Frühlingsrewachen, the final extinction of hope. As long as they were defending, they could tell themselves they were buying time, protecting Germany, delaying the inevitable, perhaps, but serving some purpose. The offensive destroyed this rationalization. They'd attacked, achieved tactical success, then watched it all vanish as Soviet reserves crushed them. Now they knew with certainty that Germany couldn't win through defense or offense. The war was over. Only the dying remained. Henrik Larsen, sitting in a trench on March 19th, after 3 days of continuous retreat, wrote in his diary, "We are dead men still breathing. The war ended at Stalingrad. Everything since has been denial. I don't know why I keep fighting. Habit, I suppose, or the absence of any alternative. If there's a purpose to this, God hasn't shared it with me." Hitler's response to the offensive's failure revealed his own detachment from reality and moral bankruptcy. On March 28th, he issued an order stripping the 4 SS divisions that participated in Frühlingsrewachen of their Kampfband titles, their primary identifying insignia. This was intended as punishment for failing to achieve objectives that were impossible. The order, delivered through SH channels, directed that divisions previously identified as Das Reich, Totenkopf, Leibstandarte, and Wiking would henceforth be known only by number. It was a petty revenge on soldiers who died by the thousands attempting impossible missions. Division commanders, including Wiking's Herbert Otto Giel, refused to implement the order. Soldiers continued wearing their cuff bands. Hitler's punishment had no practical effect, except demonstrating that the regime they served held them in contempt. Some soldiers, learning of Hitler's order, finally understood they were expendable tools discarded when no longer useful. The oil fields that Frühlingsrewachen ostensibly aimed to recapture were never reached and wouldn't have mattered if captured. German petroleum production had collapsed under strategic bombing. Synthetic fuel plants were destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. Romanian oil fields, previously supplying most of Germany's petroleum, had been lost when Romania switched sides. Hungarian oil fields at Nagykanisa produced perhaps 5% of Germany's needs. Recapturing them would have provided fuel for a few weeks of operations at most. the strategic justification for the offensive was always illusory. The real reason was Hitler's psychological inability to accept defeat, manifesting as military operations that served no purpose except killing more soldiers on both sides. Frühlingserwachen was mass sacrifice to a cause that no longer existed, if it ever had. That German soldiers, even at this late stage, continued following orders to attack into Soviet artillery speaks to discipline, institutional momentum, or perhaps just exhaustion too complete to permit thought of alternatives. The final week of March brought uncontrolled retreat eastward toward Austria. Soviet forces, having destroyed the offensive, now pursued with armored spearheads that advanced 40 kilometers daily. Wiking Division conducted fighting withdrawals, delaying actions, and desperate stands to allow supply columns and stragglers to escape. None of it mattered strategically. The Red Army had momentum, numbers, equipment, and righteous fury driving them west toward Germany. Every hour they were delayed cost Soviet lives, but hours couldn't change the war's outcome. Henrik Larsen's crew, now fighting as infantry because their tank was gone, survived another 2 weeks before Larsen was wounded by artillery fragments. He was evacuated through medical channels and didn't return to the division. His war was over. For thousands still with Wiking, the war would continue for another 5 weeks, retreating through Austria, dying in battles that historians would barely note, until surrender finally ended a conflict that should have concluded months earlier. April 2nd, 1945. Hungarian-Austrian border near Kőszeg. Oberscharführer Mart Kalda, an Estonian platoon sergeant with Narva Battalion, led 43 men east to west across a landscape that embodied defeat. Behind them, 10 kilometers back, Soviet advance units pursued with methodical efficiency. Ahead, the Austrian Alps rose against a spring sky, beautiful and indifferent. Kalda's platoon was a microcosm of Wiking's disintegration. 19 Estonians, 11 Germans, 7 Danes, 4 Flemish, and 2 Norwegians, who'd somehow ended up attached to his unit when their own company dissolved. They had no vehicles except a captured Soviet truck that burned more oil than fuel. They had ammunition for perhaps 2 firefights. They had no radio contact with battalion headquarters, which might not exist anymore. They marched west because west was where the Americans were, and Americans took prisoners instead of shooting SS men on sight. That was the entirety of their strategy. Walk toward the army least likely to execute them. The Hungarian-Austrian border region in early April was chaos geography made manifest. Retreating German columns clogged roads built for agricultural traffic, not military evacuation. Wounded soldiers rode in horse carts because there were no ambulances. Supply trucks, empty of supplies but full of desperate men fleeing the Soviet advance, moved bumper to bumper. Austrian civilians watched the procession with expressions ranging from pity to contempt. Some offered food, most closed their doors and shutters, wanting no association with defeated soldiers who'd brought war to their countryside. Soviet aircraft, now operating with impunity in skies the Luftwaffe no longer contested, strafed columns randomly, killing soldiers and civilians indiscriminately. The Yak-9s and Sturmoviks came in low, machine guns ripping through truck canvases and human bodies, then departed before anyone could organize anti-aircraft response. The attacks were militarily unnecessary. The Germans were retreating anyway, but the Red Army had reasons beyond military necessity for inflicting casualties. Mart Kalda's platoon experienced their closest call on April 4th near Wiener Neustadt. They had taken shelter in a barn when Soviet tanks appeared on the road they'd just left. 3 T-34s, moving without infantry support, advancing westward faster than retreating German columns. Kalda faced an immediate decision: remain hidden and hope the tanks passed, or engage with the 2 Panzerfaust rockets his platoon possessed and risk attracting attention. He chose concealment. His men, hidden in the barn's hayloft, watched through gaps in the walls as Soviet tankers buttoned up and rolled past, 60 meters away. One Estonian volunteer, a 20-year-old named Tuomas Rebane, raised his rifle, instinct overwhelming judgment. Kalda grabbed the barrel before Rebane could fire. They locked eyes. Kalda shook his head once. Rebane lowered the rifle. The tanks continued past. 5 minutes later, they heard explosions from the west. The tanks had caught a German column and were methodically destroying it. Kalda's platoon waited an hour before leaving the barn. The decision to hide probably saved all their lives. The disintegration of military structure accelerated with each passing day. On April 7th, Calda's platoon encountered remnants of 3 other SS divisions moving in the same general westward direction, but with no coordination. A group of perhaps 200 soldiers from Totenkopf, Leibstandarte, and Das Reich divisions had coalesced around a Hauptsturmführer who claimed to have orders to establish a defensive line near Graz. No one believed this. Graz was 100 kilometers away and defending it was pointless. But the officer had rank and a plan, which was more than most soldiers possessed. Calda's platoon joined the group briefly, if only for the psychological comfort of numbers. They marched together for 2 days before Soviet artillery scattered the formation. Calda's platoon continued independently. The Hauptsturmführer was last seen heading southeast, opposite the direction of retreat, either completely disoriented or suffering a psychological break. No one followed him. Desertion rates, impossible to quantify accurately, were certainly substantial. Every night, men disappeared from formations. Some genuinely got lost in darkness. Others deliberately vanished, discarding uniforms and attempting to blend into civilian populations. The Flemish and Dutch volunteers had the easiest time disappearing. Their languages and appearances let them pose as displaced forced laborers heading home. Germans faced harsher scrutiny, but might hide among Austrian civilians if they had rural backgrounds. Estonians and other Eastern Europeans had nowhere to go. Returning home meant Soviet occupation and certain imprisonment or execution. Mart Calda knew at least 6 men from his original company had deserted since March. He didn't report them. The concept of military justice had become absurd when the military itself was disintegrating. Let men save themselves however they could. The wounded presented the cruelest dilemmas. Wiking's medical services had collapsed completely by mid-April. Field hospitals were overrun or abandoned. Ambulances were non-existent. The division had perhaps a dozen doctors still with the retreating columns, treating hundreds of wounded with supplies scavenged from captured Soviet stocks. Calda's platoon accumulated wounded they couldn't treat or transport. A Danish soldier with a leg wound that was clearly infected and needed amputation they couldn't perform. A German with abdominal wounds who needed surgery, unavailable anywhere in the province. An Estonian with severe concussion who couldn't walk unassisted. On April 10th, the Danish soldier died from sepsis. They buried him beside the road, unmarked. The German died 2 days later. The Estonian with concussion gradually improved, but would probably suffer effects for life. These weren't combat deaths. They were deaths from medical system collapse, which felt somehow worse. Vienna's suburbs provided brief respite and worse chaos simultaneously. The city, designated a fortress by Hitler and therefore required to be defended until complete destruction, was being systematically reduced to rubble by Soviet artillery and house-to-house fighting. Wiking's remnants skirted the southern outskirts, avoiding the urban battle, but unable to avoid its consequences. Tens of thousands of Viennese civilians were fleeing westward on the same roads as retreating soldiers, creating refugee columns that stretched for kilometers. Austrian women with children, elderly men pulling handcarts, families carrying whatever possessions they could manage. Soviet aircraft strafed these columns as readily as they strafed military targets. Calda's platoon, moving through the refugee masses on April 16th, helped bury 27 civilians killed in an air attack on the road to Amstetten. There was no ceremony, no chaplain, just German soldiers and Austrian civilians digging mass graves in a farmer's field. The farmer watched from his house, saying nothing, his expression suggesting he'd seen this scene too many times already. April 25th brought the last coherent military action Mart Calda's platoon participated in. Near Steyr, 80 kilometers west of Vienna, they encountered a Waffen-SS Kampfgruppe attempting to delay Soviet advance long enough for supply columns to escape. The Kampfgruppe consisted of perhaps 300 men from multiple divisions, 4 operational tanks, and a battery of artillery. Their defensive position blocked a bridge over the Enns River. The plan was simple: hold for 24 hours, then withdraw across the bridge and demolish it. Calda's platoon was absorbed into this defense, assigned to protect the artillery positions from Soviet infantry infiltration. The battle lasted 19 hours. Soviet forces probed throughout April the 26th, then launched a full assault at dawn on April 27th. The artillery fired until barrels overheated. The tanks engaged Soviet armor at ranges where both sides could penetrate each other's armor. Mutual suicide at 800 meters. Calda's platoon repelled 3 Soviet infantry assaults, expending nearly all their ammunition. At 1400 hours, orders came to withdraw. The bridge was demolished at 15:30. Soviet forces were visible on the eastern bank as the charges detonated. The final days of April brought recognition that organized military operations had ceased. What remained of Wiking Division was scattered across Austrian territory in groups ranging from platoon-sized to ad hoc formations of hundreds. Radio communications were intermittent or non-existent. Supply was whatever could be scavenged. Orders, when they came, were usually ignored if they conflicted with survival. Herbert Otto Gille, the division commander, was attempting to maintain some organizational structure, but could only contact perhaps a third of his nominal strength. His strategy, such as it was, involved moving all units west toward American lines before Soviet forces could encircle them entirely. This meant abandoning wounded who couldn't walk, destroying remaining vehicles to prevent capture, and accepting that the division as an organizational entity had ceased to exist. All that remained were soldiers trying to survive the next few days until surrender became possible. May 5th brought a surreal officers' conference at Rastatt, a small town in the Austrian Alps. Giel had assembled perhaps 40 officers representing various Wiking elements, still maintaining communication. The topic was simple: where and to whom should they surrender? Soviet forces were closing from the east. American forces were approximately 50 kilometers west. British forces were operating to the south. Yugoslav partisan forces were in the southeast, and everyone agreed surrendering to them would be fatal. The officers debated surrendering immediately versus continuing to move west to ensure they reached American custody. Some argued for dispersing entirely, having men discard uniforms and attempt to hide among civilians. Others insisted on maintaining unit cohesion and surrendering formally. The meeting produced no consensus because there was no good option. Eventually, Gille gave guidance: move west in whatever group still existed, attempt to reach American lines, surrender when contact was made. Each officer would make his own decisions for his own men. Military hierarchy had dissolved into every man for himself. May 8, 1945, somewhere in Austria between Rastatt and Salzburg. Mart Calda's platoon, now reduced to 37 men after losing 6 to wounds and illness during the final week, heard via radio that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. They were in a forest, had been for 3 days, hiding from Soviet patrols and moving west through the mountains. The news should have brought relief. Instead, it brought uncertainty. Were they still soldiers of a defeated army with rights under Geneva Convention, or were they SS war criminals subject to immediate execution? Would Americans honor surrender, or would they hand SS prisoners to Soviets? Should they discard their uniforms and attempt escape, or present themselves formally as defeated soldiers? Calda gathered his men and explained the situation bluntly. The war is over. We lost. We've been losing since Stalingrad, maybe since Barbarossa. Now we survive or we don't. We'll approach American lines tomorrow morning with white flags. We'll surrender properly. Anyone who wants to run is free to go. I won't stop you, but I think formal surrender gives us the best chance. 5 men left that night. The remaining 32 stayed together. May 9th, early morning. Calda's group approached American positions near St. Georgen, white cloth tied to rifles held high. American soldiers, men from 7th Army's 42nd Infantry Division, took them prisoner with a mixture of professionalism and curiosity. The Americans searched them, confiscated weapons, photographed the SS insignia on their collars and cuff bands for intelligence purposes. They provided food, real food in quantities the Germans hadn't seen in months. White bread, canned meat, chocolate. They asked questions through an interpreter. What unit? When did you last see combat? Any officers present? The interrogation was businesslike, not hostile. Within 6 hours, Calda's group was in a POW cage with several hundred other captured SS soldiers from various divisions. They were alive. They were prisoners. The war was over. What came next? None of them knew. But for the first time in months, they slept without artillery fire in the background, without fear of waking to Soviet attacks. The war had finally, actually, ended. The reckoning was about to begin. May 9th, 1945. Rastatt, Austria, American 7th Army custody. Erich Walter, the Danish volunteer who had joined Wiking in early 1941 and survived 4 years of Eastern Front combat, sat in a muddy field with 300 other prisoners waiting for processing. American soldiers stood guard, M1 rifles held casually, expressions suggesting boredom more than hostility. Walter had discarded his SS tunic before surrender, wearing only a Wehrmacht field jacket over his uniform trousers, hoping to obscure his service branch. It hadn't worked. The Americans had screening teams checking every prisoner for SS blood group tattoos under the left arm, the mark identifying Waffen-SS members. Walter had the tattoo, his blood type in neat Gothic letters, applied during training in 1941. When the American medic discovered it during screening, he marked Walter's forehead with a grease pencil, SS. The mark meant automatic transfer to a dedicated SS prisoner compound for further investigation. Walter's fate, like all captured Waffen-SS personnel, would depend entirely on what investigators discovered about his unit's actions and his personal role. The divergent fates of Wiking veterans began at the moment of surrender based on geography. Approximately 4,200 soldiers from the division surrendered to American or British forces in Austria between May 8th and May 10th. Another estimated 1,800 surrendered to or were captured by Soviet forces east of the demarcation lines. Perhaps 2,000 more simply vanished, killed in the final days and never recorded, died of wounds after surrender, succeeded in discarding uniforms and disappearing into civilian populations, or remained unaccounted for through bureaucratic chaos. The lucky ones, if anyone could be called lucky, were those who reached American custody. The United States, while treating Waffen-SS as a criminal organization requiring investigation, generally followed Geneva Convention protocols. Prisoners received food, medical care, and processing through formal channels that eventually led to either war crimes prosecution or repatriation. The screening process in American custody was systematic but overwhelmed by scale. 7th Army had captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners in the war's final weeks, including tens of thousands of Waffen-SS from multiple divisions. Intelligence teams had to distinguish Wehrmacht conscripts from SS volunteers, combat soldiers from concentration camp guards, and war criminals from men who'd simply fought on the wrong side. The blood group tattoo was the most reliable identifier, though not all Waffen-SS members had them. The practice began in 1941, so earlier recruits might not be tattooed. Interrogators asked about unit histories, dates of service, battles participated in, commanders' names. They examined paybooks and identification documents. They checked names against lists of wanted war criminals compiled from survivor testimony and captured German records. The process took weeks, sometimes months. During this time, prisoners lived in massive cage compounds, barbed wire enclosures in open fields, sometimes holding 10,000 men with minimal shelter. Erich Walter's interrogation on May 18th revealed the complexity of assigning guilt. The American lieutenant conducting the interview, a German-speaking intelligence officer, asked detailed questions. When did you join? Where did you train? Which battles did you fight in? Were you ever in Warsaw? Did you witness or participate in atrocities against civilians? Walter answered carefully, telling the truth about most things. Yes, he'd joined voluntarily in early 1941, motivated by anti-communism and adventure. Yes, he'd fought across the Eastern Front in numerous battles. No, he'd never been in Warsaw. His regiment was deployed elsewhere during the uprising. Regarding atrocities, he claimed ignorance. I saw combat against Soviet soldiers. I never saw civilians killed intentionally. We heard rumors about Einsatzgruppen, but never witnessed their operations. The interrogator took notes, his expression neutral. Walter had no way of knowing if he was believed, or if his answers would result in prosecution or release. The Danish and Norwegian volunteers faced the least severe consequences among Western Europeans. Scandinavia, though occupied, had maintained some governmental structures under German control, and public opinion about volunteers was complex rather than uniformly condemnatory. Denmark and Norway both prosecuted collaborators after liberation, but sentences varied wildly. Some volunteers received 10 to 15 years for treason. Others received 3 to 5 years, or were released after a year of investigative detention. The determining factors included when they joined, whether they'd committed specific war crimes, and somewhat arbitrarily, public sentiment about their individual cases. Eric Walter was repatriated to Denmark in September 1945, tried for treason in January 1946, and sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. He served 4 years before early release in 1950. His experience was relatively mild compared to others. May 9, 1945. Maribor, Yugoslavia, partisan custody. Edward Kask, an Estonian machine gunner with Narva Battalion, sat in a barn that served as temporary holding facility for captured SS prisoners. The Yugoslav partisans who'd captured his group had separated Estonians from Germans immediately, correctly understanding that Balts were viewed differently by their Soviet allies. Kask and 43 other Estonians waited in the barn under guard, uncertain of their fate but fearing it based on the partisans' expressions. Cold hatred mixed with satisfaction at having captured SS men. On May 10th, Soviet NKVD officers arrived and took custody of the Estonian prisoners. The transfer was documented with receipts and manifests, bureaucratic formality masking what everyone understood. These men were being delivered to Soviet justice, and Soviet justice for SS volunteers from occupied territories was predetermined. The NKVD officer examining Kask's identification documents smiled without humor. Estonian SS, you fought for fascists against your own people. We have special camps for traitors like you. The fate of Baltic Waffen SS volunteers represented the war's harshest ironies. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had been independent between 1918 and 1940, occupied by Soviets in 1940 under Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact terms, liberated by Germans in 1941, then reconquered by Soviets in 1944 and 45. From the Baltic perspective, they had been occupied by 2 totalitarian powers successively. Many volunteers who joined the Waffen-SS did so to fight Soviet occupation, not from Nazi ideological commitment. This nuance meant nothing to Soviet authorities. In Stalin's framework, anyone who had served with Germans was a traitor, regardless of motivation. Baltic SS volunteers faced automatic conviction for treason, collaboration, and war crimes. Sentences were typically 10 to 25 years in Gulag labor camps. Many wouldn't survive their sentences. Edward Kask's transport to the Soviet Union took 3 weeks, traveling in cattle cars from Yugoslavia through Hungary and Ukraine to camps in the Ural Mountains. The conditions were deliberately brutal. 200 men per car designed for 40, no sanitation beyond a hole in the floor, minimal food and water. Men died en route from dysentery, dehydration, or simply giving up. Kask survived the transport and arrived at a camp near Perm in early June. The camp held approximately 8,000 prisoners, a mixture of German PEs, Baltic SS volunteers, Ukrainian collaborators, and Soviet citizens convicted of various political crimes. The work was logging, 14-hour days in forests, cutting timber with hand saws, dragging logs to collection points, meeting daily quotas regardless of weather or health. Food was black bread and thin soup, calculated to provide just enough calories to keep prisoners working, but insufficient for long-term survival. The camp administration's explicit philosophy was that prisoners should be worked until they died, then replaced with new prisoners. There was no pretense of rehabilitation or eventual release. The Western European volunteers who ended up in Soviet custody faced similar but slightly less severe treatment. Dutch and Flemish prisoners, if captured by Soviet forces, were generally held for 2 to 3 years before being repatriated to their home countries for trial. The Soviets viewed them as misguided volunteers rather than ethnic traitors, a meaningless distinction in terms of camp conditions, but significant for eventual release prospects. A Dutch volunteer named Peter Janssen, captured near Vienna in May 1945, spent 27 months in a Soviet camp before being returned to Netherlands in August 1947. He stood trial for collaboration, was convicted, and served 6 additional years in Dutch prison. His total punishment was 8.5 years of imprisonment, harsh but survivable. Estonian. Volunteers like Edward Kask had no hope of such outcomes. They would serve their full sentences or die trying. Most died. May 11, 1945. British custody, southern Austria near Carinthia. Hauptsturmführer Johann Steiner, a German tank officer with Wiking's Panzer Battalion, surrendered to British armored units with the remains of his company. The British, like the Americans, separated SS prisoners from Wehrmacht immediately. But the British zone included a unique complication. Approximately 30,000 Cossack soldiers and their families who had fought for Germany against the Soviet Union. These men, along with Yugoslav partisans who had sided with Germans, had reached British-controlled territory hoping for asylum. The British government faced a decision: grant asylum and antagonize their Soviet ally, or repatriate these anti-communist fighters, knowing Stalin would execute or imprison them. In one of the war's most controversial decisions, the British chose forced repatriation. Starting in late May, British soldiers rounded up Cossacks and Yugoslavs, loaded them onto trains and trucks, and delivered them to Soviet custody despite desperate resistance. Johann Steiner witnessed the Cossack repatriation at Judenburg on May 28th. British soldiers, clearly uncomfortable with their orders, used batons and rifle butts to force Cossack families onto trucks. Women clutched children, old men wept. Some Cossacks committed suicide rather than flee and face Soviet repatriation. A former Red Army colonel shot his wife and children, then himself, rather than allowing Soviet capture. British soldiers, traumatized by what they were being ordered to do, nevertheless followed orders. The entire operation was filmed by British Army cameramen, footage that remains deeply disturbing. Steiner, watching from his POW compound, realized that surrender to Western allies didn't guarantee safety or justice. The geopolitics of the emerging Cold War meant that some prisoners were protected by Geneva Convention, while others were expendable bargaining chips. Fortunately for Steiner, German Waffen-SS prisoners weren't subject to forced repatriation. They would be investigated, possibly prosecuted, but not delivered to Soviet revenge. The war crimes investigations began in earnest during summer 1945, as Allied intelligence teams gained access to German military records. Wiking Division's unit war diaries, personnel files, and operational reports were captured largely intact, providing detailed documentation of the division's actions throughout the war. Investigators focused on several specific incidents: the division's role in suppressing the Warsaw Uprising, their participation in anti-partisan operations in Ukraine and the Caucasus, and proximity to Einsatzgruppen massacres. The evidence was substantial but complicated. Unit records confirmed Wiking's presence in Warsaw and documented security operations that clearly involved civilian killings. However, individual responsibility was difficult to establish. Could every soldier in a battalion be held accountable for war crimes committed by elements of that battalion? How much did individual volunteers know about the Holocaust and other Nazi atrocities? These questions had legal and moral dimensions that prosecutors struggled to address. Eric Walter's Danish trial in January 1946 exemplified the legal ambiguities. Prosecutors charged him with treason for voluntarily serving in a foreign military organization, fighting against Denmark's interests and allies. The evidence of service was indisputable: his enlistment records, military identification, and his own admission. His defense argued that Denmark was occupied when he joined, that he was motivated by anti-communism rather than pro-Nazi ideology, and that he never committed war crimes personally. The prosecution countered that joining the Waffen-SS, an organization-designated criminal at Nuremberg, made him complicit in all SS crimes regardless of personal actions. The court's verdict acknowledged complexity: guilty of treason, sentenced to 7 years, but recognizing mitigating factors of youth and propaganda influence. Similar trials across Scandinavia produced wildly inconsistent results. Some volunteers got 15 years, others got 3. Occasionally, someone was acquitted entirely. Justice was imperfect and subjective. Edward Kask never faced trial in any meaningful sense. In September 1946, Soviet authorities held a mass tribunal for 500 Baltic SS volunteers at the Perm camp. The proceeding lasted 1 day. Each prisoner was called before a 3-officer panel, asked to confirm their identity and service record, then sentenced. No defense attorneys, no witnesses, no opportunity to present mitigating circumstances. Kask was convicted of treason, banditry, and crimes against the Soviet people, sentenced to 25 years hard labor. The sentence was formulaic. Almost everyone received either 25 years or execution. Kask received the labor camp sentence, perhaps because he had been captured rather than surrendering voluntarily, perhaps randomly. He began serving his sentence immediately, transferred to a logging camp in Siberia, where temperatures reached -40 Celsius in winter. Of the 500 Baltic volunteers sentenced that day, fewer than 100 would survive to see release after Stalin's death in 1953, prompted limited amnesty for some political prisoners. The three fates of Wiking veterans, exemplified by Walter, Kask, and Steiner, revealed the profound arbitrariness underlying post-war justice. Geography at the moment of surrender determined everything. 20 kilometers difference between surrendering to Americans versus Soviets meant the difference between 4 years in a Danish prison versus 25 years in Siberian camps. Nationality mattered enormously. Danish volunteers faced finite sentences. Estonian volunteers faced near certain death in gulags. Personal actions mattered far less than these accidents of geography and ethnicity. Men who'd committed war crimes sometimes escaped prosecution entirely if they surrendered in the right location, while others who had merely fought as soldiers faced execution or decades of imprisonment. The system wasn't designed for individual justice. It was designed to process millions of prisoners through bureaucratic mechanisms that couldn't account for individual circumstances. Some survived, many didn't. None were unchanged by what they'd experienced in both war and captivity. September 15, 1946. Copenhagen, Denmark. The courtroom was smaller than expected, a converted municipal building rather than grand hall of justice. Eric Walter sat in the defendant's dock, wearing civilian clothes provided by authorities, watching as prosecutors presented evidence of his service in the Waffen-SS. The evidence was comprehensive. Enlistment documents from 1941 showing he'd volunteered willingly, unit rosters placing him with Wiking Division throughout the war, testimony from other Danish volunteers describing life in the division. The prosecutor, a severe man in his 50s, who'd spent the war years in hiding after refusing to collaborate, built his case methodically. Walter had betrayed Denmark by serving a foreign power. He'd worn the uniform of an organization-designated criminal at Nuremberg. He'd participated in a war of extermination against the Soviet Union. The fact that he personally hadn't murdered civilians was irrelevant. His service enabled those who did. The prosecutor's closing argument was brief. This man chose to fight for Nazism. Denmark must choose to punish traitors. The legal framework for prosecuting Waffen-SS volunteers varied dramatically across Europe, creating a patchwork of justice that reflected each nation's war experience and political priorities. In Denmark and Norway, where collaboration had been limited and occupation relatively mild, trials focused on treason. Volunteers had broken allegiance to their homelands by serving foreign powers. Sentences were measured in years, not decades, and aimed partly at rehabilitation. In Netherlands and Belgium, where collaboration had been more extensive and German occupation harsher, prosecutors sought longer sentences for both treason and complicity in war crimes. France, with fewer volunteers but harsher memories of occupation, conducted fewer trials but handed down severe sentences. Germany itself, divided into occupation zones, saw varying approaches. Western zones prosecuted clear war criminals but released many former soldiers, while the Soviet zone imprisoned former SS members almost automatically. The Nuremberg International Military Tribunal's declaration in 1946 that the SS was a criminal organization created legal complications for prosecutors. The Bau Tribunal's judgment stated that membership in the SS after September 1939, with knowledge of its criminal activities, constituted a war crime. However, the tribunal explicitly excluded conscripts and noted that individual trials should determine personal culpability. This created a burden for prosecutors, proving not just SS membership, but also knowledge of criminality and opportunity to refuse service. For Wiking volunteers who joined in 1941, before the Holocaust's full scope became apparent, proving criminal knowledge was challenging. Defense attorneys argued that young men joining in 1941 couldn't have known about Auschwitz, which hadn't yet begun mass murder operations. Prosecutors countered that the regime's eliminationist anti-Semitism was publicly known, and volunteers must have understood they were serving a genocidal regime. Eric Walter's defense attorney, appointed by the court, presented arguments common to hundreds of similar trials. Walther was 19 when he volunteered, young and susceptible to propaganda. Nazi ideology had portrayed the Soviet Union as an existential threat to European civilization, and Walther had believed this propaganda sincerely. He'd never participated in atrocities personally, never witnessed massacres, and served purely in combat roles fighting armed Soviet soldiers. His motivation was anti-communism, not pro-Nazism. If Germany had been democratic and fighting the USSR, he might have volunteered anyway. The attorney presented character witnesses, Walther's former schoolteacher describing him as a good student, a neighbor attesting to his family's respectability. The defense concluded by noting that Walther had surrendered rather than fleeing, demonstrating willingness to face justice. The arguments were reasonable, but ultimately insufficient. The court convicted him of treason in December 1946, sentencing him to 7 years imprisonment with credit for time served since surrender. Hamburg, Germany, 1947. British authorities conducted war crimes investigations focused on specific incidents rather than organizational membership. A team of investigators, including both British officers and German prosecutors, examined Wiking Division's role in suppressing the Warsaw Uprising. They gathered testimony from Polish survivors who described Waffen-SS tanks providing fire support during massacres in Ochota and Wola districts. They examined captured German documents, including Wiking's unit war diary entries for August 1944, which noted security operations and pacification measures in Warsaw. They identified specific Wiking officers who had commanded units present during documented atrocities. The investigation culminated in arrest warrants for 12 Wiking veterans, mostly German officers, charged with murder and crimes against humanity. Several were never located, 5 were tried, resulting in 3 convictions, with sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years. The evidentiary challenges in these trials were substantial. Survivors could often describe atrocities in detail, but couldn't always identify specific perpetrators years after events. German military records used euphemistic language. Security operations might mean legitimate combat against partisans, or might mean mass murder of civilians. Defendants claimed they had fought only armed insurgents and that any civilian deaths were tragic but unavoidable results of urban combat. The legal standard required proving intent and criminal action beyond reasonable doubt. Many prosecutions failed because evidence, though suggestive, wasn't conclusive. A Norwegian volunteer named Knut Andersen was charged with participation in executions near Kiev based on testimony placing his unit in the area. At trial, documentary evidence showed his company had been in the region, but couldn't prove he personally participated in killings. He was acquitted in 1948, emigrated to Argentina, and lived there until his death in 1973. The Baltic states presented the most problematic cases from a justice perspective. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were reoccupied by Soviet forces and incorporated into the USSR. Show trials conducted by Soviet authorities in 1946 and 47 convicted thousands of Baltic Waffen-SS veterans in mass. Eduard Kask's trial in September 1946 was representative. 500 defendants processed in one day, minimal evidence beyond service records, predetermined sentences of execution or 25 years hard labor. These weren't judicial proceedings by Western standards. They were political theater designed to punish collaboration and terrorize populations into submission. Western nations formally protested the lack of due process but took no action. The Cold War was beginning, and Baltic states were firmly within the Soviet sphere. Their populations' fate wasn't a priority for Western governments focused on rebuilding their own countries. Felix Steiner, the division's architect and longtime commander, experienced a fate that exemplified the arbitrariness of post-war justice. Arrested by British forces in May 1945, he was held for investigation until 1948. Prosecutors considered charging him with war crimes related to Wiking's operations, but evidence directly linking him to specific atrocities was limited. His command responsibility for crimes committed by his division was established, but British authorities were reluctant to prosecute command responsibility cases aggressively, partly because it might set precedents affecting Allied officers. Steiner was released in November 1948 without prosecution. He wrote several books about his wartime experiences, portraying the Waffen-SS as honorable soldiers fighting Bolshevism, and became a prominent figure in veteran organizations. He consulted for West German military planners during NATO's formation, advising on tactics against potential Soviet invasion. The man who'd led a division implicated in multiple war crimes died peacefully in Munich in 1966, never having faced trial. The conviction statistics, compiled across multiple jurisdictions, reveal the incomplete nature of post-war justice. Of an estimated 4,000 Wiking veterans who surrendered to Western allies, approximately 300 faced war crimes charges. Of those, roughly 120 were convicted, receiving sentences from 5 years to life imprisonment. Most served fewer than 10 years before Cold War amnesty programs released them. Of 1,800 veterans captured by Soviet forces, virtually all were convicted in show trials or administrative proceedings. Perhaps 400 died in camps before 1953, when Khrushchev's reforms prompted limited releases. The 2,000 unaccounted veterans escaped, prosecution entirely successfully hiding their service or dying before identification. This meant that the majority of division veterans, approximately 55 to 60%, never faced any legal consequences for their service in an organization that participated in a war of extermination. The legal ambiguities extended to fundamental questions about individual versus organizational guilt. If the Waffen-SS was a criminal organization, was every member automatically guilty of war crimes, or did individual guilt require proof of personal criminal acts? The Nuremberg Tribunal tried to split this difference. Membership with knowledge was criminal, but actual punishment should reflect individual circumstances. This created a system where some volunteers received harsh sentences for organizational membership alone, while others who'd clearly committed atrocities received light sentences or no prosecution due to evidentiary problems. A Danish volunteer who'd merely fought on the Eastern Front might serve 7 years for treason, while a German officer who had commanded units during massacres might serve 3 years or avoid prosecution entirely. The injustice was obvious, but seemingly unavoidable given the scale of prosecutions and limitations of evidence. The impact on survivors and victims added another layer of complexity. Polish survivors of the Warsaw Uprising watched as many SS men who'd participated in suppressing their revolt receive minimal sentences or no prosecution. Soviet citizens who'd endured occupation and witnessed atrocities saw German veterans released within years, while Soviet POWs who'd surrendered without fighting remained in gulag camps for decades. The disparity reflected Cold War priorities. Western nations needed West German cooperation against Soviet threat, and therefore couldn't be too harsh on former German soldiers. Meanwhile, Soviet justice was indiscriminate and brutal, punishing victims and perpetrators with similar severity. Holocaust survivors watched as concentration camp guards received death sentences, while combat SS divisions members walked free, creating perception that the international community cared more about punishing camp functionaries than soldiers who'd enabled the genocidal system. By 1950, the momentum for prosecuting Waffen-SS veterans had largely dissipated. Western nations had more immediate concerns: rebuilding economies, containing Soviet expansion, integrating millions of refugees and former soldiers into civilian life. Continuing trials decades after the war seemed both impractical and politically counterproductive. West Germany's government, led by Konrad Adenauer, pushed for amnesty and integration of former soldiers into society. The argument was pragmatic. Germany needed these men's skills, and dwelling on their past service would prevent reconciliation. Critics argued this constituted moral failure, allowing war criminals to escape justice for political convenience. Both perspectives had validity. The resulting compromise satisfied no one. Some justice for some crimes, but systematic accountability remained elusive. Men like Erich Walter served their sentences and re-entered society. Men like Eduard Kask died in camps. Men like Felix Steiner lived comfortably, their crimes unpunished. The reckoning had been incomplete, constrained by practical limitations and political priorities that valued present stability over historical justice. June 12, 1951, Göttingen, West Germany. A conference room in a modest hotel where 43 former Waffen-SS officers gathered for the founding meeting of HIAG, Hilfsgemeinschaft of Gegenseitigkeit der Angehörigen der ehemaligen Waffen-SS, the Mutual Aid Society of former Waffen-SS members. Felix Steiner sat at the head table, flanked by officers from multiple SS divisions, including Wiking, Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf. The stated purpose was humanitarian, providing assistance to imprisoned veterans, supporting widows and orphans, helping former soldiers reintegrate into civilian life. But the unstated purpose, clear from the speaker's rhetoric, was political, rehabilitating the Waffen-SS's reputation by constructing a narrative of honorable soldiers who'd fought bravely against communism while having nothing to do with Nazi atrocities. Steiner's opening address set the tone. We were soldiers like any others, fighting for our homeland against Bolshevik aggression. History will vindicate us once the hysteria fades and truth emerges. The formation of HIAG represented a coordinated effort to control the historical narrative before academic historians could establish scholarly consensus. The organization recruited aggressively, eventually claiming 40,000 members, including an estimated 1,200 identified Wiking veterans. HIAG published a magazine, Der Freiwillige, the Volunteer, which featured articles portraying Waffen-SS divisions as multinational crusaders defending Western civilization. The magazine solicited memoirs from veterans, provided editorial guidance emphasizing heroism and brotherhood while minimizing or omitting war crimes, and published these narratives as primary historical sources. For readers in the 1950s and 60s, before archives opened and academic research challenged these accounts, HIAG publications shaped public understanding of the Waffen-SS. The strategy was effective. By controlling the first wave of published memoirs, HIAG created a narrative framework that later historians would spend decades dismantling. The common elements across veteran memoirs were remarkably consistent, suggesting coordination or at minimum shared talking points. First, emphasis on defensive operations. Memoirs focused extensively on Cherkasy encirclement, fighting withdrawals in Hungary, and desperate last stands rather than offensive operations deeper in Soviet territory where war crimes occurred. Second, denial of Holocaust knowledge. Veterans claimed universally that frontline soldiers knew nothing about extermination camps, Einsatzgruppen, or systematic genocide, despite documentary evidence placing SS divisions in proximity to these operations. Third, emphasis on multinational composition. Scandinavian, Dutch, and Flemish volunteers were highlighted to portray the Waffen-SS as European movement rather than German organization. Fourth, comparison to Allied forces. Memoirs frequently noted that Wehrmacht and Allied armies also committed war crimes, implying moral equivalence. Fifth, anti-communist framing. Service was presented as defending Europe against Soviet totalitarianism, with the awkward fact that they'd served a different totalitarian regime conveniently minimized. Eric Walter, released from Danish prison in 1950 after serving 4 years of his 7-year sentence, published his memoir in 1958 titled 4 Years on the Bursum. Eastern Front, a Danish volunteer's story. The book exemplified the genre's conventions. Walter described his initial motivations as idealistic anti-communism, portrayed training as rigorous but fair, detailed numerous combat operations emphasizing bravery and camaraderie, and carefully avoided discussing anything controversial. Warsaw wasn't mentioned despite Wiking's documented presence there. Walter's regiment had been elsewhere, which was true, but the omission meant readers learned nothing about the division's most criminal operation. The book contained no reflection on serving a genocidal regime, no acknowledgement that fighting Bolshevism had meant enabling Nazi atrocities. Reviews in Danish newspapers were mixed. Some praised the combat descriptions, others condemned the author for sanitizing his service. The book sold well, particularly in Scandinavia, and contributed to a narrative that Danish and Norwegian volunteers had been misguided patriots rather than Nazi collaborators. The contradictions between veteran memoirs and documentary evidence became stark as archives opened in the 1970s and 80s. Researchers accessing German military records, Soviet archives, and testimony from civilian survivors discovered substantial discrepancies. A Norwegian volunteer named Bjorn Larsen published a memoir in 1962, claiming his unit had never participated in anti-partisan operations and had no knowledge of civilian killings. In 1978, a German historian named Hans-Peter Klausch discovered Larsen's unit war diary in Bundesarchiv, which explicitly described security operations in Ukraine during 1942, including burning villages and executing suspected partisans. When confronted with this evidence, Larson claimed not to remember those operations or suggested the documents were Soviet forgeries. This pattern repeated across dozens of cases, veterans denying participation in documented events, claiming not to remember what unit records proved they'd witnessed, or insisting that documentary evidence was falsified propaganda. The most extreme revisionism involved outright denial of well-documented atrocities. Veterans of Wiking's Warsaw operations consistently claimed they'd fought only armed home army fighters and that any civilian deaths were unfortunate but unavoidable collateral damage. This narrative was maintained despite Polish survivor testimony describing deliberate massacres, despite German court convictions of Wiking veterans for murder in Warsaw, and despite the division's own records noting pacification operations that killed thousands. In 1970, a West German documentary titled The Warsaw Uprising, 1944, included interviews with Polish survivors and confronted a Wiking veteran named Helmut Schmidt with testimony that his unit had participated in mass executions. Schmidt's response was characteristic. "That's completely false. We fought soldiers, not civilians. These Polish witnesses are lying or confused. We were honorable soldiers." The documentary's producers noted that Schmidt's unit records placed him in Ochota district during the documented massacres, making his denial implausible at best. The generational dynamic complicated efforts at truth. By the 1970s and 80s, many veterans were elderly men, grandfathers, respected members of communities. Their families often knew little about their wartime service. Discussing the war was taboo in many households. When journalists or historians confronted veterans with evidence of war crimes, families sometimes reacted with denial and hostility, unable to reconcile the grandfather they knew with allegations of participation in atrocities. This created a shield around veterans. Families became defensive, communities rallied around old men being persecuted for wartime service, and public sympathy often favored aged veterans over historical accuracy. Prosecutors attempting to reopen war crimes cases in the 1980s faced death threats from veteran supporters and struggled to find witnesses willing to testify against popular community members. The Canadian case of Albert Helmut Rauka exemplified how long veterans could evade accountability through denial. Rauka, an Estonian who had served with Wiking before transferring to a killing unit in Lithuania, emigrated to Canada in 1950 using false documents claiming he'd been a simple soldier. He lived quietly in Toronto for 30 years, working as a streetcar driver, known as a kind neighbor and devoted family man. In 1982, Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal's organization identified him through documents showing he'd personally selected thousands of Jews for execution in Kovno Ghetto. Canadian authorities arrested Rauka, who maintained complete innocence. He'd been a cook, never participated in selections. The documents were mistaken identity. His family insisted he was being persecuted by Jewish organizations seeking revenge. The evidence, however, was overwhelming. Photographs showing him at selections, survivor testimony identifying him, SS records confirming his role. Rauka was awaiting extradition to West Germany when he died of a heart attack in custody in 1983, avoiding trial. His case revealed how comprehensively some veterans had hidden their pasts and how effectively they'd constructed false identities that even families believed. The advent of internet forums in the late 1990s and early 2000s gave elderly veterans new platforms for sharing their narratives. Websites dedicated to Waffen-SS history featured sections where veterans could post memories and answer questions. The tone was often nostalgic, focusing on brotherhood, military excellence, and youthful adventure. One Wiking veteran, posting under a pseudonym in 1999, described his service. "We were Europe's finest, volunteers from a dozen nations united against communist barbarism. The training was tough, but made us strong. The combat was terrible, but we faced it together. I'm proud of my service and reject all the lies told about us since the war." When other forum users asked about Holocaust knowledge or Warsaw operations, responses were defensive. Frontline soldiers didn't know about camps. We heard rumors, but nothing concrete. Warsaw was legitimate anti-partisan warfare. Insurgents forfeited civilian protections by taking up arms. The forums became echo chambers where veterans reinforced each other's narratives, insulated from historical evidence that contradicted their memories. Some veterans, however, broke the silence and admitted uncomfortable truths. In 2003, a former Wiking soldier named Klaus Müller gave an interview to German television at age 81. Müller described witnessing his unit burn Ukrainian villages in 1942 as anti-partisan operations, though he claimed the villages were empty when burned. He acknowledged that his company had been present during civilian roundups, though he insisted he personally hadn't participated. Most significantly, he admitted, "We knew something terrible was happening to Jews. We saw them being rounded up and transported east. We heard gunfire from forests and saw smoke. Maybe we didn't know the precise details of gas chambers, but we knew they were being killed." Anyone who claims total ignorance is lying to themselves. Muller's honesty was rare among his generation. Many veterans, right until their deaths in the 2000s and 2010s, maintained that they'd known nothing, done nothing wrong, and been honorable soldiers unfairly maligned by post-war propaganda. The final interviews with dying veterans in the 2010s provided last opportunities for truth, often missed. Journalists racing to document the last living witnesses before they died sometimes encountered men who had maintained denial for 70 years and weren't about to change. A Norwegian veteran interviewed in 2012, age 94, insisted, "I fought the Russians. I never hurt civilians. Everything you have been told about the SS is communist propaganda." When shown his unit's war diary describing anti-partisan operations he'd participated in, he claimed not to remember or suggested the documents were fabricated. He died in 2014, having never publicly acknowledged his unit's documented crimes. His obituary, written by family, described him as a veteran who'd fought against communism and suffered post-war persecution for his service. The historical record told a different story, but the veteran had successfully controlled his personal narrative until death. The memory war continued even into the grave, with veterans' chosen narratives competing against documentary evidence for future generations' understanding of who they'd been and what they'd done. September 23, 1948. Pullach, West Germany, headquarters of the Gehlen Organization. Alfons Rebon, an Estonian former Waffen-SS officer who had commanded units in Wiking Division before transferring to Estonian SS formations, sat across a desk from a CIA officer whose name he wasn't given. The American spoke German with a slight accent. Explaining the opportunity, the United States needed intelligence on Soviet military capabilities, political structures in occupied Baltic states, and potential resistance networks that might be activated in event of war. Rebane, having fought the Soviets for 4 years and possessing extensive knowledge of Estonian underground networks, was exactly the asset American intelligence sought. The American was blunt about complications. "We know about your SS service. We know about operations you commanded. Under different circumstances, you'd be standing trial. But circumstances have changed. The Soviets are the threat now. We need people who know how to fight them. Are you interested?" Rebane considered briefly, then nodded. What choice did he have? The alternative was deportation to Soviet custody and certain execution. This way, he could continue fighting the enemy he'd always believed was the real threat. The CIA's recruitment of former Waffen-SS members, particularly Baltic volunteers, began almost immediately after the war, as the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union dissolved into Cold War confrontation. American intelligence agencies faced a critical intelligence gap. They knew relatively little about the Soviet military, internal security apparatus, or conditions in newly occupied territories. The Waffen-SS veterans, particularly those from Baltic states, possessed exactly the knowledge CIA needed. They had fought Soviet forces extensively, understood Red Army tactics and organization, spoke Russian and local languages, and maintained contacts with underground resistance movements in Soviet-occupied territories. The moral compromise was explicit. American intelligence would overlook war crimes in exchange for intelligence value. Documents declassified in the 1990s reveal that CIA officers knew about SS veterans' backgrounds, including participation in atrocities, but prioritized Cold War needs over justice concerns. The operations were extensive and sophisticated. The CIA ran multiple programs recruiting former Waffen-SS veterans for intelligence gathering, propaganda operations, and sabotage training. One program, codenamed Operation Bloodstone, actively recruited displaced persons from Eastern Europe for intelligence work, including many SS veterans. Another initiative trained Baltic volunteers to infiltrate Soviet-occupied territories, establish intelligence networks, and prepare for potential partisan warfare if World War III erupted. Alphonse Rebane became a valuable asset, providing detailed information on Soviet military dispositions in Baltic states and helping recruit other Estonian veterans for intelligence operations. The CIA paid well, provided comfortable housing in West Germany, and protected recruits from war crimes investigations. For men like Rebane, who faced execution if returned to Soviet control, the arrangement was mutually beneficial, regardless of the moral compromises involved. The British Secret Intelligence Service operated similar programs with even less concern for veterans' backgrounds. A former Wiking officer named Eduard von Dellingshausen, a Baltic German who'd commanded reconnaissance units, was recruited by MI6 in 1949 to run agents into Soviet-occupied Latvia. Dellingshausen had been investigated for war crimes related to anti-partisan operations, but never prosecuted due to insufficient evidence. British intelligence regarded this as fortunate. His lack of conviction meant employing him created no legal complications. From 1949 through 1953, Dellingshausen managed networks of agents infiltrating Latvia, gathering intelligence on Soviet military installations and political conditions. Most agents were captured and executed. Soviet counterintelligence had penetrated the networks almost from inception, but the operations continued because intelligence value, however minimal, justified the risks to expendable assets. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, American-funded broadcasting services targeting Soviet populations, employed numerous former Waffen-SS veterans as announcers, translators, and content producers. The broadcasts required native speakers who understood local conditions and could craft propaganda resonating with audiences behind the Iron Curtain. Estonian, Latvian, and Ukrainian SS veterans were ideal candidates. They spoke the languages, understood the cultures, and had authentic anti-communist credentials. Starting in 1952, Radio Liberty's Estonian service employed at least 7 identified former Waffen-SS members, including several Wiking veterans. They broadcast news, cultural programming, and anti-Soviet propaganda, encouraging resistance to communist rule. The irony was noted by some observers. Men who'd served a totalitarian regime were now broadcasting messages of freedom and democracy. But in Cold War logic, their past service was less important than their present utility against Soviet communism. The political rehabilitation accelerated during the 1950s, as West Germany rearmed and joined NATO. The Federal Republic needed experienced military officers to build the Bundeswehr, its new armed forces. Many qualified officers had served in the Wehrmacht or Waffen-SS during the war. The dilemma was straightforward: exclude these veterans and lack experienced cadre, or accept them despite their pasts and face criticism for military continuity with the Nazi regime. West Germany chose pragmatism, accepting many former officers, including some with SS backgrounds, if they hadn't been convicted of war crimes. Felix Steiner, though too prominent to be formally employed, served as an informal advisor on Soviet tactics and armored warfare doctrine. His expertise, gained leading Wiking and other SS divisions, informed NATO planning for potential conflict with Warsaw Pact forces. The Cold War had transformed Steiner from war criminal suspect to valued expert in less than a decade. The Baltic émigré communities in the West actively promoted a narrative of SS service as anti-Soviet resistance, rather than collaboration with Nazism. Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian diaspora organizations, particularly strong in the United States, Canada, and Australia, portrayed Baltic Waffen-SS volunteers as freedom fighters who had chosen the lesser evil when faced with 2 totalitarian options. This framing resonated in Cold War America, where anti-communism was the dominant political ideology. American politicians, cultivating Baltic émigré votes, attended commemorations honoring Baltic SS veterans. In 1967, a monument to Estonian soldiers who'd fought against Soviet occupation was dedicated in Toronto, explicitly including Waffen-SS veterans among those honored. Protests from Jewish organizations and Soviet diplomats were dismissed as communist propaganda. The Cold War context had transformed traitors and collaborators into heroes of anti-communist resistance. The 1970s brought some pushback, as the Holocaust's historical significance became more prominent in public consciousness. The television miniseries Holocaust in 1978 sparked renewed attention to Nazi crimes and complicity. Journalists began investigating prominent émigrés, discovering that some community leaders had SS backgrounds they'd concealed or minimized. Several exposés revealed that men honored as freedom fighters had participated in operations that killed thousands. The revelations created tensions within émigré communities. Younger generations questioned their parents' and grandparents' service, while older veterans doubled down on denials and justifications. The broader American public, largely unaware of Waffen-SS history's complexities, struggled to reconcile images of kind grandfathers with allegations of war crimes committed decades earlier. The 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union and Baltic states' independence created the final phase of rehabilitation. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, newly independent after 50 years of Soviet occupation, faced the question of how to remember their complicated World War II history. The dominant narrative that emerged portrayed the war as a tragedy where small nations were crushed between two totalitarian powers. Waffen-SS service, in this framing, represented an understandable choice made by men trying to prevent Soviet reoccupation. Annual commemorations began honoring all soldiers who'd fought against Soviet forces, explicitly including Waffen-SS veterans. In 1998, Estonia issued a postage stamp honoring Alphonse Rebane, the CIA asset who'd commanded SS units. In 2004, veterans of Baltic Waffen-SS units held a public commemoration in Riga, Latvia, attended by government officials and documented by international media. These rehabilitations provoked international controversy. The European Union, which Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania sought to join, expressed concern about honoring Waffen-SS veterans. Jewish organizations protested that the commemorations whitewashed participation in genocide. The Holocaust had killed 95% of Baltic Jews, often with local collaboration. Russian officials, though hardly objective observers given Soviet crimes, accurately noted that the Waffen-SS was convicted as a criminal organization at Nuremberg. Baltic governments responded that their nation's history was unique, that Soviet occupation had been as criminal as Nazi occupation, and that veterans who'd fought, Soviet forces deserved recognition regardless of which uniform they'd worn. The arguments reflected genuine historical complexity. Baltic states had suffered terribly under both Nazi and Soviet rule, and many volunteers had genuinely believed they were defending their homelands. But the arguments also minimized or ignored Baltic collaboration in Holocaust operations and obscured the reality that serving the Waffen-SS meant enabling Nazi genocide regardless of individual motivations. The Cold War's end and subsequent decades revealed the full extent of the moral compromises made during the ideological struggle against communism. American intelligence had knowingly employed men responsible for atrocities, protecting them from prosecution because their expertise against the Soviet Union was deemed valuable. Western governments had overlooked war crimes for geopolitical convenience. Émigré communities had constructed heroic narratives that excluded uncomfortable truths, and newly independent Baltic states, eager to establish national identities distinct from Soviet occupation, had embraced problematic historical figures as symbols of resistance. The result was a tangled historical legacy where SS veterans were simultaneously war criminals, Cold War assets, freedom fighters, and genocidal collaborators depending on which national or political perspective one adopted. Truth was the casualty in these memory wars, replaced by competing narratives serving present political needs rather than historical accuracy. Understanding Wiking Division's complete history required cutting through decades of myth-making, denialism, and politicization to reach the uncomfortable reality beneath. March 8, 1995, Bundesarchiv, Freiburg, Germany. Dr. Jürgen Matthias, a German military historian, sat in the reading room examining Wiking Division's war diary from August 1944, the Warsaw Uprising period. The entries were typewritten on yellowing paper, the bureaucratic language obscuring horrific content. August 12th, Security operations continued in Ochota District, resistance eliminated in sectors 3 through 7, civilian evacuation procedures implemented. Matthias cross-referenced this entry with Polish survivor testimony and German police reports from the same date. Civilian evacuation procedures meant mass executions. The War Diary's euphemistic language matched other Nazi documents. Special treatment meant murder, resettlement meant deportation to death camps, security operations meant killing civilians. The documentary evidence was clear and damning. Wiking Division had participated in operations that deliberately targeted non-combatants. The question wasn't whether these operations occurred. The archival record settled that. The question was how to contextualize them within the division's broader history and the historical narratives surrounding the Waffen-SS. The opening of Eastern European archives after the Cold War revolutionized scholarly understanding of Waffen-SS divisions generally and Wiking specifically. Soviet military archives, previously closed to Western researchers, contained extensive documentation of German operations, including war crimes investigations, captured documents, and interrogations of prisoners. Polish archives held detailed records of the Warsaw Uprising, including specific unit identifications and witness testimony. Even German archives, though well studied, yielded new insights as researchers applied more rigorous methodologies and asked different questions. The 1990s through 2000s saw publication of numerous scholarly works that systematically demolished the myths constructed by veteran organizations. These studies, written by German, American, British, Polish, and Israeli historians, reached consensus on several key points despite approaching the subject from different national perspectives. The scholarly consensus established that Wiking Division was responsible for documented war crimes, but was not directly involved in Holocaust killing operations. This distinction mattered historically and morally. Wiking was a frontline combat division that fought primarily against Soviet military forces. They weren't Einsatzgruppen conducting systematic mass murder of Jews in occupied territories. They weren't concentration camp guards participating in industrialized genocide. However, they did commit war crimes in 3 categories. First, anti-partisan operations that deliberately targeted civilians under pretext of security. Second, participation in suppressing the Warsaw Uprising using methods that violated laws of war. Third, proximity to and occasional support for Einsatzgruppen operations without direct participation in shooting actions. The evidence for these conclusions came from multiple independent sources: German military records, Soviet investigations, survivor testimony, and post-war German court proceedings. The documentation was sufficient to establish divisional responsibility beyond reasonable dispute. The statistical analysis provided context that challenged both veteran narratives and simplistic condemnation. Dr. Christian Gerlach, a German historian studying anti-partisan warfare, analyzed civilian death tolls attributable to different German units operating in Ukraine and Belarus. His 2004 study found that Wiking Division's anti-partisan operations killed an estimated 8,000 civilians during the war, predominantly in Ukraine during 1942 and 1943. This was horrific, but actually lower than average for Wehrmacht units operating in the same regions. Typical Wehrmacht security divisions killed 15,000 to 20,000 civilians. Einsatzgruppen killed hundreds of thousands. Wehrmacht police units killed tens of thousands. Wiking's casualty count was criminal, but placed them in the middle range of German military criminality rather than at the extreme. This finding didn't exonerate the division. It contextualized their crimes within a Wehrmacht that was systematically criminal rather than uniquely SS-driven atrocity. The foreign volunteer motivations remain subject to historical debate because motivations were internal states that left limited documentary evidence. Dr. Robert Galately, studying recruitment records and intercepted mail from volunteers, published findings in 2002 suggesting motivation categories. Approximately 30% joined primarily for anti-communist ideological reasons, genuinely believing they were defending Europe against Bolshevism. 25% joined for opportunistic reasons, including pay, adventure, or escaping difficult circumstances in occupied territories. 30% by 1944 were essentially conscripts facing limited alternatives after their homeland's collaboration, made them targets for resistance movements. Only the 15% showed strong Nazi ideological commitment, including explicit anti-Semitism and support for racial policies. These percentages challenged both veteran claims that they were all ideological anti-communists and prosecutorial claims that volunteers were all Nazi fanatics. The reality was messy. Mixed motivations, evolving understanding, and declining ideological commitment as the war turned against Germany. The military effectiveness assessment revealed Wiking as tactically superior to average Wehrmacht units, but unable to overcome strategic failures inherent in Germany's Eastern Front campaign. Dr. David Glantz, the preeminent American historian of the Eastern Front, analyzed Wiking's combat record across multiple campaigns. His 2008 study found that Wiking consistently achieved higher kill ratios against Soviet forces than comparable Wehrmacht divisions, roughly 4 Soviet casualties for each German casualty versus 3-to-1 for Wehrmacht infantry divisions. This reflected better training, superior equipment, and higher motivation. However, Glantz noted that tactical excellence was strategically irrelevant. The Soviet Union could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Wiking's effectiveness merely meant they survived longer and killed more Soviets before inevitable defeat. The study concluded, elite units like Wiking demonstrate that tactical skill cannot compensate for strategic impossibility. Germany lost the Eastern Front not because its soldiers fought poorly, but because the entire war was unwinnable, given resources and distances involved. The comparative criminality analysis challenged the clean Wehrmacht myth while also complicating simplistic SS versus Wehrmacht distinctions. Multiple studies in the 2000s examined war crime rates across German military organizations. Dr. Wolfram Vette's 2006 book, The Wehrmacht, History, Myth, Reality, synthesized this research, finding that Wehrmacht divisions committed anti-partisan atrocities at similar or higher rates than Waffen-SS divisions. The difference was that Wehrmacht atrocities were often decentralized, unit-level decisions, while SS divisions operated within an organizational culture that explicitly endorsed racial warfare. Wiking's war crimes were comparable in scale to Wehrmacht units, but occurred within an organizational framework that ideologically justified them. This made SS divisions more systemically criminal, even when individual crime counts were similar. Wette's conclusion: the Waffen-SS was categorically a criminal organization, not solely because of what it did, but because criminality was integral to its identity and purpose. The Wehrmacht committed equivalent crimes, but could theoretically have not done so while remaining the Wehrmacht. The Waffen-SS could not. The national memory differences created ongoing historiographical tensions. German historians tended toward comprehensive analysis of institutional criminality, reflecting Germany's post-war culture of historical responsibility. Estonian and Latvian historians emphasized volunteers' anti-Soviet motivations and the tragedy of being caught between totalitarian powers, reflecting their nation's complicated relationship with World War II. Russian historians, though often propagandistic, correctly documented specific atrocities that Western historians initially dismissed as Soviet exaggerations before archival access confirmed them. Polish historians focused extensively on Warsaw Uprising operations, producing detailed studies of Wiking's role that German historians sometimes criticized as overstating division's involvement. Scandinavian historians examined their country's volunteers with mixture of condemnation and contextual understanding, reflecting societies that had both punished collaborators and gradually accepted veterans back into communities. The varying national perspectives meant that no single definitive history of Wiking existed. Instead, multiple overlapping histories reflected different priorities and interpretations. The forensic investigations in former war zones provided grim physical evidence supporting documentary records. In 2010, Ukrainian and German archaeologists excavated a mass grave near Zhytomyr containing remains of approximately 400 civilians killed in 1942. Forensic analysis determined they'd been shot execution style, hands bound, multiple victims shot simultaneously. Documents placed Wiking Division's Westland Regiment in the area during the relevant period conducting security operations. The physical evidence corroborated Soviet-era war crimes investigations that Western historians had previously treated skeptically. Similar excavations across Ukraine, Poland, and Belarus during the 2000s and 2010s repeatedly confirmed that many Soviet allegations about German atrocities, once dismissed as propaganda, were substantially accurate. The forensic evidence created uncomfortable implications for Western Cold War narrative that had sometimes downplayed Soviet claims about Nazi crimes. The final scholarly assessment, synthesized across hundreds of studies by dozens of historians from multiple countries, reached conclusions that satisfied no ideological faction completely. Wiking Division was neither the elite crusaders of veteran mythology nor simply Nazi death squad of prosecutorial simplification. They were a well-trained multinational military formation that fought effectively in conventional combat while also committing systematic war crimes under organizational and ideological frameworks that explicitly valued racial warfare. Individual soldiers range from genuine ideological Nazis to apolitical adventurers to coerced conscripts. Their motivations evolved over time as realities of war and genocide became undeniable. Some maintained Nazi commitment until death. Others experienced genuine moral crisis. Most simply survived without deep ideological reflection. They served a genocidal regime, enabling its crimes even when not directly participating in them. They fought skillfully, but for an irredeemably criminal cause. Understanding their history required holding these contradictions simultaneously, recognizing tactical competence while condemning strategic purpose, acknowledging individual complexity while assigning collective responsibility, and refusing both the hero worship veterans sought and the simplistic demonization that obscured historical reality. The reckoning, 70 years after the war's end, remained incomplete but substantially more honest than the myths that had dominated for decades. February 16, 2024. Cherkasy, Ukraine, Battlefield Memorial Site. Dr. Olena Shevchenko, a Ukrainian historian specializing in World War II, led a small group of international visitors across muddy fields where Wiking Division had fought its desperate breakout exactly 80 years earlier. The landscape had changed dramatically. Collective farm fields had reverted to private plots. Soviet monuments had been removed after Ukrainian independence, and new construction encroached on what had been battlefield. But the terrain's basic contours remained. The ravines where wounded Germans had frozen to death, the ridge where Soviet tanks had intercepted retreating columns, the marshy ground that had trapped vehicles abandoned in panic. What made the tour particularly surreal was the contemporary context. Just 40 kilometers east, Russian forces were invading Ukraine in 2022's renewed war. History was repeating, not precisely but disturbingly. Again, foreign soldiers fought across Ukrainian farmland. Again, civilians were caught between armies. Again, atrocities were committed and denied. Shevchenko paused at a depression where local legend claimed hundreds of bodies were buried. "We study this history," she said, hoping to learn from it, but apparently we don't learn enough. The last confirmed Wiking Division veteran died in 2016 at age 97 in Norway. His death, noted briefly in local newspapers, marked the end of living memory. No more interviews would reveal new information. No more confrontations between veterans and survivors would occur. The history had transitioned completely from lived experience to archival record and scholarly interpretation. This transition was both liberation and loss. Liberation because veterans could no longer control the narrative through selective memory and denial. Loss because the irreplaceable first-hand perspective vanished regardless of its flaws and biases. The generation that had fought, perpetrated, witnessed, and survived was gone. What remained were documents, testimony collected over decades, forensic evidence, and the ongoing struggle to understand what happened and what it meant. The contemporary politics of Wiking. Memory revealed how historical understanding served present ideological needs. In Baltic states, particularly Estonia and Latvia, annual commemorations continued honoring veterans who'd fought against Soviet occupation, including Waffen-SS members. These events provoked reliable outrage from Russia, which used them for propaganda, portraying Baltic states as Nazi sympathizers. The European Union expressed concern but took no action, caught between supporting member states' sovereignty and maintaining principles against honoring SS veterans. Jewish organizations protested consistently, arguing that any commemoration of Waffen-SS service legitimized participation in genocidal organizations. Baltic officials responded that their nation's history was unique and that Soviet crimes justified any resistance, including service with Germany. The arguments, repeated annually, never resolved because they reflected fundamentally incompatible historical frameworks. Two Baltic nationalists, Wiking, veterans were tragic figures who chose lesser evil. To Jewish organizations and Holocaust scholars, they were war criminals who enabled genocide. Both perspectives had factual foundations. Reconciling them proved impossible. The Tallinn Memorial controversy of 2022 exemplified these tensions. Estonian authorities approved a monument honoring all Estonians who fought for independence, explicitly including Waffen-SS veterans. The monument's inscription read, "To those who fought against Soviet occupation, 1940 to 1945. Protesters noted that this framing obscured who these men fought alongside and what that alliance enabled. The inscription made no mention of the Holocaust, of Nazi genocide, or of civilians killed during security operations. It presented a sanitized narrative where Estonian soldiers were simply patriots defending their homeland. When critics demanded context, supporters responded that monuments weren't history textbooks and couldn't include every nuance. The debate went nowhere because both sides prioritized different values: national pride versus historical accuracy, resistance mythology versus genocidal complicity. The monument was completed despite protests, reflecting Estonian government's calculation that domestic politics outweighed international criticism. The lessons some observers drew from Wiking's history concerned how ideological extremism recruits ordinary people. The division's foreign volunteers weren't uniformly Nazi fanatics. Many were young men susceptible to propaganda portraying complex geopolitical situations in simplistic good versus evil terms. Nazi recruitment successfully convinced thousands that joining the SS meant defending European civilization, not serving a genocidal regime. 21st century parallels emerged uncomfortably. Foreign fighters joining ISIS used remarkably similar rhetoric about defending Islam against Western aggression. Foreign volunteers in Ukraine's conflict, fighting on both Russian and Ukrainian sides, often described their motivations using civilizational defense language that echoed Wiking propaganda. The mechanisms of radicalization, the narratives that convinced people to join foreign military causes, and the rationalizations that allowed participants to minimize their complicity showed disturbing continuity across 8 decades. The journalist Lars Eriksson, grandson of the Norwegian Wiking volunteer mentioned in earlier chapters, spent 3 years researching his grandfather's service for a book published in 2020. Eriksson had grown up knowing vaguely that his grandfather had fought in World War II, but understanding few details. The family didn't discuss it. After his grandfather's death in 2012, Eriksson found letters, photographs, and a journal documenting 4 years of Eastern Front service. Reading these materials, Eriksson experienced a crisis. The grandfather he'd loved was revealed as a volunteer for SR, the Waffen-SS who'd fought in Ukraine, witnessed atrocities, and never expressed remorse. Eriksson's book, My Grandfather's War, a Norwegian SS volunteer and the legacies of shame, wrestled with how to acknowledge family love while condemning historical actions. His conclusion, I can love my grandfather as family while recognizing that he made terrible choices that enabled terrible crimes. These aren't contradictory. Complexity is uncomfortable, but history demands it. He wasn't a monster from Hollywood. He was an ordinary person who did monstrous things. That's more frightening than simple evil, because it implicates all of us in our capacity for moral failure. The archival work continued despite or because of the last veterans' deaths. In 2023, Russian forces withdrew from areas of Ukraine they'd occupied during the current war, allowing Ukrainian authorities to access areas long closed to researchers. Archaeologists discovered multiple mass graves from World War II, Era in Zhytomyr region. DNA analysis and artifact examination were ongoing, but preliminary findings suggested at least 2 sites contained victims of German anti-partisan operations from 1942. Documents placed Wiking Division units in the region during the relevant period. The discoveries meant that even 80 years later, new evidence continued emerging. Each excavation potentially resolved questions about specific incidents, identified previously unknown victims, and provided families with information about ancestors' fates. The historical reckoning remained incomplete not because historians lacked interest, but because the scope of crimes was so vast that documentation and excavation would require generations. The educational challenges manifested in schools, where teachers struggled to present Wiking's history with appropriate complexity. A Danish high school teacher, interviewed in 2023, described the difficulty. Danish students want to understand why their countrymen volunteered for the SS. If I only condemn the volunteers, students tune out because it doesn't explain anything. If I provide context about anti-communism and propaganda, some students interpret this as excuse-making. Finding balance between explanation and condemnation is exhausting, but it's necessary because without understanding how ordinary people make terrible choices, we can't recognize warning signs when similar situations emerge. The teacher showed students Eric Walter's memoir alongside scholarly refutations of its omissions, teaching them to think critically about primary sources while recognizing that even flawed memoirs revealed aspects of historical experience. The 2024 International Conference on Waffen-SS Foreign Volunteers, History, Memory, Legacy at Cambridge University brought together historians from 14 countries to share research and debate interpretations. The conference revealed continuing disagreements despite archival abundance. German historians emphasized institutional criminality and systematic nature of war crimes. Baltic historians stressed their nation's victimization by both totalitarian powers and legitimacy of anti-Soviet resistance. Polish historians focused on Warsaw Uprising atrocities and continuing inadequacy of justice. Russian historians, though few attended due to political tensions, presented research on Wiking's anti-partisan operations. Israeli historians examined Holocaust complicity and patterns of denial. The conference produced no unified conclusions beyond consensus that Wiking's history was complex, that multiple perspectives held partial truths, and that ongoing research continued refining understanding. The very existence of such conferences, impossible during the Cold War, represented progress even if complete agreement remained elusive. The final message of Wiking Division's history, as contemporary scholars understood it in the war's 80th anniversary, commemorations resisted simple summarization. The division was neither heroes nor monsters, but human beings who made choices, sometimes coerced, sometimes eager, often ambiguous, that enabled one of history's greatest crimes, while also demonstrating remarkable military competence and inspiring genuine camaraderie. The volunteers who joined believed propaganda, or sought adventure, or fled impossible circumstances. The veterans who survived constructed self-exculpatory narratives, or faced moral responsibility, or died denying everything. The societies that produced them struggled with complicity, or celebrated resistance, or maintained uncomfortable silence. And the historians who studied them argued about interpretation while agreeing on fundamental facts. Wiking Division committed war crimes, served a genocidal regime, consisted of individuals ranging from committed Nazis to coerced conscripts, and left legacies that contemporary politics continued manipulating for present purposes. Standing at Cherkasy in 2024, watching Ukrainian soldiers prepare defenses against Russian advances mere kilometers away, the contemporary relevance was inescapable. Wiking's story offered lessons for any generation, confronting totalitarianism, ideological extremism, and the human capacity for both heroism and atrocity. The lessons were uncomfortable. Ordinary people commit extraordinary crimes when convinced they're serving righteous causes. Tactical military excellence means nothing when strategic purposes are evil. Multinational cooperation can serve genocidal ends as readily as noble ones. Veterans' memories are unreliable mixtures of truth, self-justification, and denial. Historical narratives serve present politics more than past accuracy, and most disturbingly, subsequent generations repeat similar patterns despite claiming to have learned from history. Wiking Division, 8 decades after its formation, remained relevant not as cautionary tale that prevented future atrocities, but as mirror reflecting persistent human failures, our susceptibility to propaganda, our capacity for rationalization, our willingness to commit atrocities for causes we believe righteous, and our refusal to honestly reckon with uncomfortable pasts. The last veteran was dead. The history was documented, the lessons were clear, and still, the echoes continued, warning of dangers that each generation seemed determined to rediscover for itself.